When a woman in a green dress walked past Marco Duca without a second glance, she had no idea she'd just done the impossible, refused the most dangerous man in the city. He wasn't used to the word no. She wasn't used to men who didn't take it for an answer. Their collision would either destroy them both or teach a crime boss something he'd never learned. That real power isn't about control, it's about choice. Stay with me until the end of this story. If it grabs you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The bass line rattled through the floor of elevation like a second heartbeat, syncopated and relentless. Marco Duca stepped through the VIP entrance with the kind of presence that didn't announce itself. It simply was. Security nodded without making eye contact. The hostess straightened her posture before he'd even glanced her way. People moved in his orbit like planets around a sun, careful to maintain their distance while staying aware of exactly where he stood. He wasn't here for the music or the overpriced cocktails that came with sparklers attached. Business brought him to Elevation tonight. A deal that needed closing, the kind that required a neutral public space where everyone could pretend civility still mattered. Victor was already waiting in the private booth, flanked by two men who looked like they'd been grown in a lab specifically to intimidate. Marco's own associate, Luca, fell into step behind him as they crossed the club. The crowd parted without seeming to, a subtle choreography that happened wherever Marco went. Duca. Victor stood, extending a hand that Marco shook with exactly the amount of pressure the moment required, firm enough to show strength, brief enough to communicate this was business, not friendship. Victor. Marco settled into the booth, accepting the scotch Luca placed in front of him without looking at it. I trust we're ready to finalize terms. The negotiation that followed was a dance Marco had performed 100 times. Victor wanted assurances. Marco provided them with the kind of quiet certainty that made further questions seem pointless. Numbers were discussed, percentages adjusted. The deal that would move $3 million in construction contracts through carefully laundered channels took shape with all the casualness of men discussing a sports game. Marco was mid-sentence when his attention snagged on something across the club. It wasn't the dress, though the emerald green did stand out against the sea of black and metallics that dominated Elevation's aesthetic. It wasn't even the woman wearing it, necessarily. From this distance, he could see only the line of her shoulders, the fall of dark hair past them. It was the way she moved. Everyone else on that dance floor was performing. Dancing for the cameras that would end up on social media, for the people watching them, for the image they wanted to project. This woman in green was dancing for herself. Her eyes were closed. Her movements had a quality of privacy to them, as if she'd forgotten she was in a room with 200 other people. Marco? He pulled his attention back to Victor, who was watching him with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd lost his audience. Apologies. You were saying? Victor's gaze tracked across the club, landing on the woman in green, then returned to Marco with a knowing smile that made something cold settle in Marco's chest. Distracted? Momentarily. Marco kept his voice level. The terms you mentioned. But Victor was still watching the dance floor, and his smile had taken on an edge Marco didn't like. She's been here before. Comes with friends sometimes. Always leaves alone. He said it like he was providing useful intelligence, like Marco had asked. He hadn't. The terms, Marco repeated, ice creeping into his tone. The negotiation wrapped up 20 minutes later. Victor left with his security detail. The contracts would be signed by the end of the week, and Marco should have felt the satisfaction of another successful deal. Instead, he found his attention drifting back to the dance floor. The woman in green was still there, though the crowd had shifted around her. As he watched, a man approached her. Expensive suit, too much cologne probably. The kind of aggressive confidence that mistook persistence for charm. Marco saw her shake her head, saw the man lean closer anyway, saw the exact moment her body language shifted from polite disinterest to clear boundaries. The man didn't take the hint. His hand landed on her waist. Marco was moving before he'd consciously decided to. Luca followed without question, a shadow that had learned long ago not to ask why. He reached them just as the woman stepped back from the man's grip, her expression shifting from annoyed to something sharper. I said no. Come on, just one dance. The man reached for her again. She said no. Marco's voice cut through the music with the kind of quiet authority that made the man's hand freeze mid-reach. The man turned, irritation already forming on his face, then went pale as he registered who he was looking at. Mr. Duca, I was just leaving. Marco didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The man left. Marco turned to the woman in green, expecting gratitude, maybe an introduction, perhaps an invitation. What he got was a look of cool assessment that seemed to find him only marginally more interesting than the man who'd just fled. Thanks, she said, not warmly, but I had it handled. Up close she was striking rather than beautiful in the conventional sense. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it smiled easily when it wasn't set in a line of irritation. Eyes that were currently looking at him like he was another problem to be managed rather than a solution that had arrived. I'm sure you did. He offered his hand. Marco. She glanced at his hand, then back at his face, and didn't take it. Ava. A pause. And I'm good, thanks. It took him a moment to understand what she meant. She was declining, not just his handshake, the entire implicit offer that came with his intervention, the drink he would have bought, the conversation that would have followed, the evening that might have extended beyond this club into the kind of night that started with champagne and ended with tangled sheets and no promises. She was saying no. Marco couldn't remember the last time someone had said no to him about anything that mattered, and he was surprised to find the sensation wasn't entirely unpleasant. Are you sure? You look like you could use a drink after that. I'm sure. Her tone suggested this was the end of the conversation. It should have been. Marco knew how to read people. It was a survival skill in his world, as essential as knowing which streets to avoid after dark or which politicians stayed bought. This woman wasn't playing hard to get. She wasn't testing him or angling for more. She genuinely wanted him to leave her alone. So naturally, he found himself more intrigued than he'd been by anything in months. Fair enough. He stepped back, giving her space. Enjoy your night, Ava. Something flickered in her expression, surprise, maybe, that he was actually leaving. You too, Marco. He walked away before the urge to push further could override his better judgment. Luca fell into step beside him, carefully saying nothing, though Marco could feel the curiosity radiating off him. They were halfway back to the VIP section when Victor intercepted them, that knowing smile still plastered across his face. I saw that. She turned you down. He said it like it was funny, like Marco's rejection was entertainment for the evening. Marco looked at him. Just looked, with the kind of steady, empty gaze that made men remember exactly who they were talking to. Victor's smile faltered. Good night, Victor. They left the club 20 minutes later. In the car, Luca finally broke the silence. You want me to find out who she is? Marco watched the city slide past the window, lights blurring into ribbons of neon and sodium glow. No. He could feel Luca's surprise but didn't explain. The truth was, he did want to know who she was. Every instinct he'd honed over 15 years of building an empire from nothing told him to gather information, to turn mystery into data, to transform the unknown into something he could understand and therefore control. But something else, something he didn't have a name for and didn't entirely trust, told him that would be the wrong move. That if he wanted to understand the woman who'd looked at him like he was ordinary and boring and dismissed him without a second thought, he'd have to do something he almost never did. He'd have to wait. He'd have to earn it. The thought should have irritated him. Instead, it sat in his chest like an ember, small and bright and warming from the inside out. Pausad. 3 days passed. Marco told himself he wasn't thinking about her, which was a lie he didn't examine too closely. He went through the motions of his life. Meetings with his legitimate business interests in the morning, calls with his less legitimate ones in the afternoon, dinners where deals were made over ossobuco and expensive wine. He didn't go back to elevation. That would have been obvious, even desperate. But he found himself aware of Fridays and Saturdays in a way he hadn't been before. Found his mind wandering to what she might be doing, whether she'd gone back to the club, whether she ever thought about the man who'd intervened and then, miraculously, left her alone. On Thursday evening, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers were rarely good news in his line of work. But something made him pick up. Is this Marco Duca? A woman's voice, professional, unfamiliar. Who's asking? My name is Jennifer Park. I'm a grant coordinator with the Westside Community Center. Your name was given to me as someone who might be interested in supporting our literacy program. Marco's mind went immediately to damage control. Who had given his name out? For what purpose? I think you have the wrong person. Perhaps. She didn't sound convinced. But I was told you were someone who valued education and community development. We're looking for sponsors for our adult literacy initiative. If you have a moment, I'd love to tell you about the work we're doing. He should have hung up. Should have passed this to whoever handled his legitimate charitable foundations. Yes, he had those. Everyone in his tax bracket did, and they served useful purposes beyond just looking good on paper. But something in the woman's voice, a thread of genuine passion beneath the professional pitch, made him pause. Tell me. She did. The Westside Community Center served one of the neighborhoods Marco knew well, though not from the perspective of someone who used community centers. This was territory he'd grown up in. Streets he'd walked when walking the wrong way at the wrong time could get you killed. The center offered GED programs, job training, English classes for immigrants, and adult literacy tutoring. We have about 40 students currently, Jennifer said. People who fell through the cracks of the education system, who are trying to build better lives but can't even fill out a job application without help. We're looking for sponsors who can fund one-on-one tutoring sessions. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't come with a gala or your name on a building, but it changes lives. What's the ask? Marco was already running calculations in his head. This wasn't the kind of charity that came with photo opportunities or tax advantages complex enough to matter. This was small, local, the kind of thing that wouldn't move any needles for his reputation, which, perversely, made it more interesting. $5,000 covers one student's tutoring for a year. Materials, tutor compensation, assessment costs. We're hoping to sponsor 20 new students this cycle. $100,000 then, pocket change for what he made in a week. Send me the information. I'll have my people look at it. Of course. May I ask who referred you to us? Good question. I don't actually know. The message didn't say. He hung up and stared at his phone, turning the conversation over in his mind. Someone had given a community center his name. Someone who knew enough about him to have his contact information, but apparently thought he'd be interested in literacy programs. It bothered him not knowing. Marco didn't like mysteries, at least not ones that involved his own business. He was still thinking about it Friday night when he found himself, against his better judgment, back at Elevation. We doing another deal? Luca asked as they made their way through the crowd. No. Marco scanned the space, looking for green, for dark hair, for a woman who danced like she'd forgotten the world existed. Just a drink. Luca didn't comment, but Marco could feel his amusement. She wasn't there. He stayed for an hour, nursing scotch he didn't taste, watching the door like a man who'd lost something valuable and couldn't remember where he'd left it. The rational part of his brain pointed out how ridiculous this was. The rest of him didn't care. He was about to leave when he saw her. Not in green this time. She wore black jeans and a simple gray top that should have been unremarkable but somehow wasn't. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she was laughing at something one of her friends had said, her whole face transforming with it. Marco made himself finish his drink before standing, made himself cross the club at a normal pace rather than the direct trajectory his instincts demanded, made himself wait until there was a natural break in her conversation before approaching. Ava. She turned and he watched recognition flash across her face, followed by something that might have been resignation. Marco. She didn't sound thrilled. I wanted to apologize. The words came out before he'd fully planned them. For the other night. I shouldn't have inserted myself into your situation. Her eyebrows rose slightly. You're apologizing for getting rid of a creep? I'm apologizing for assuming you needed me to. He kept his voice level, his posture open. You said you had it handled. I should have respected that. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Her friends had gone quiet, watching this exchange with the kind of interest that suggested they'd been briefed on who he was, or at least that she'd mentioned him. Okay, she said finally. Apology accepted. He should have left it there, should have nodded and walked away and let this stay in the category of brief interactions that didn't go anywhere. Instead, He heard himself say, "Can I buy you a drink?" No agenda, just a drink. I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? Because I don't know you. She said it simply, without hostility. And because men who look like you and dress like you and move through the world like you do are usually complicated in ways I'm not interested in. It was the most honest rejection he'd ever received. Fair enough, he stepped back. Enjoy your night. He made it 5 steps before her voice stopped him. Marco. He turned. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Why? Why what? Why do you want to buy me a drink? You don't know me either, and you could have any woman in this club. The truth would have sounded insane, because you looked at me like I was ordinary, because you said no and meant it, because I can't remember the last time someone treated me like I was just a man instead of a means to an end. Because you're interesting, he said instead, and I don't meet interesting people very often. Something shifted in her expression. One drink. Here, not somewhere private, and I'm leaving with my friends when I'm ready to leave. Deal. They ended up at the bar rather than in the VIP section, her choice, and he respected it even though he could feel the attention their presence drew. People were watching, phones were probably filming, and tomorrow there would be speculation about who she was and what it meant that Marco Duca was buying her drinks like a college kid trying to impress a girl. He found he didn't care. So what do you do, Ava? He kept his tone casual, curious rather than interrogating. I'm a literacy tutor. She said it watching him like she was testing something. The coincidence hit him like cold water. At the Westside Community Center? Her expression shifted to surprise, then something more guarded. How did you know that? Someone from there called me yesterday, asked me to sponsor the program. He was starting to piece it together. That was you. Not exactly. She took a sip of her drink, gin and tonic, simple and unpretentious. My coordinator handles fundraising, but I might have mentioned that you seemed like the kind of person who valued education. Based on one conversation where I got rid of a drunk guy? Based on your reputation. She met his eyes. I asked around after you left. Found out who you are, or at least who people say you are. This was the moment it usually ended. When people found out what he did, or more accurately, what they suspected he did, they either ran or they tried to get closer for all the wrong reasons. He waited to see which category Ava would fall into. So you know, he said carefully, I know what people say, that you run half the construction in this city, that you're connected, that people who cross you tend to have unfortunate accidents. She said it matter-of-factly, without judgment, but without absolution either. I don't know if any of it's true, but I know you have money and influence, and my students need both. The honesty of it was startling. So you used me. I gave your name to someone who's trying to help people. She didn't look away. If that makes you angry, you can leave. He should have been angry. Should have felt manipulated, used, played. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to admiration. How many students? Sorry? The center wants to sponsor 20 new students. How many do you work with? Personally, 4. But there's a waiting list of 60 people. Adults who can't read well enough to help their kids with homework, who can't pass the written driver's test, who have to ask strangers to read their mail because they're too ashamed to admit they can't. Her passion was unmistakable. It's not sexy charity work. It's slow and frustrating, and sometimes people drop out because life gets in the way. But when it works... She stopped, shook her head. Sorry, I tend to get on my soapbox about this. Don't apologize. Marco found himself leaning forward, genuinely engaged. When it works, what? When it works, you watch someone realize that all those doors they thought were closed forever are actually just locked, and they're learning to pick the locks. It's transformative. She paused. Your coordinator probably already sent you the information. Probably. He hadn't checked. I'll take care of it. Just like that? Just like that. He signaled the bartender for another round. What made you get into this? She hesitated, and he saw her weighing how much to share, how much trust to extend. My dad couldn't read. He hid it his whole life, had my mom handle anything that required reading, made excuses at work, memorized everything. He died when I was 16, and I found notebooks in his things, Pages and pages where he'd been teaching himself, trying to learn. He never told anyone, never asked for help. Her voice had gone quiet. I keep thinking if someone had just offered, if there had been a program, if he hadn't been so ashamed. She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. I'm sorry, Marco said, and meant it. It's why I do this, so other people don't have to hide. She met his eyes. And it's why I'm willing to take money from people like you, even if I'm not willing to date them. There it was. Clear boundary, clearly stated. He should have respected it and moved on. What if I wanted to volunteer instead of just writing a check? She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound cut through the music like light through clouds. Volunteer? Why is that funny? Because you're Marco Duca. You don't volunteer at community centers. Maybe I want to start. Her laughter faded as she realized he was serious. You're not kidding. I'm not. He wasn't entirely sure where this was coming from, some impulse he didn't recognize, some part of him that had woken up the moment she'd said no and hadn't gone back to sleep since. What would it take? Background check, training, actually showing up. She was studying him like a puzzle. Why would you want to do that? Because you're there, he didn't say. Because I want to understand what drives you. Because I want to see the world through eyes that look at me like I'm ordinary and boring and find something worth doing anyway. Because you're right, he said instead. Writing checks is easy. Actually helping is harder. And you want to do something hard? I want to do something that matters. She was quiet for a long time, searching his face for something. Lies, maybe, or ulterior motives. Whatever she found, it seemed to satisfy something. Okay. Okay, I'll get you the volunteer information. You do the background check, take the training, and if you actually show up, she paused. We'll see. It wasn't a yes to anything beyond volunteering, but it was an opening, a possibility, a door left unlocked if not quite open. Marco would take it. They talked for another hour. She told him about her students, Maria, who was learning to read so she could help her grandson with his homework, James, who needed to pass his GED to keep his job, Darius, who just wanted to read the books everyone else took for granted. He found himself telling her about growing up in the neighborhood the center served, about streets that shaped you into something harder than you'd planned to be. He didn't tell her everything, didn't mention the first time he'd collected a debt, or the way he'd learned to read people for weaknesses instead of strengths, or any of the 1,000 small moral compromises that had turned a smart kid from a bad neighborhood into the man who currently had judges and councilmen on his payroll. But he told her enough that when her friends finally came to collect her, she looked at him differently. Not warmly, necessarily, but with something that might have been understanding. Thank you for the drink, she said. Thank you for the conversation. She turned to leave, then paused. Marco? The background check is real. They're thorough. If there's anything that would disqualify you, there isn't. He'd made sure years ago that his legitimate face was spotless, even if the man behind it wasn't. I'll pass. We'll see. But she smiled as she said it, small and quick and gone, almost before it registered. He watched her leave with her friends, disappearing into the crowd, and felt the strangest sense of having won something and lost something in the same moment. His phone buzzed. Luca, texting from across the club. You good? Marco typed back. Yeah, we're leaving. In the car, Luca waited exactly 3 blocks before asking, So? So what? So are you going to see her again? Maybe. Marco watched the city blur past. If I can pass a background check. Luca's laugh was sharp and surprised. You're serious about the volunteer thing? I'm serious. Boss, you know this is crazy, right? You don't have time to make time. Marco's voice carried the weight of a decision made. Clear my Thursday afternoons. For tutoring? For whatever she needs. Luca was quiet for a moment. You sure about this? Marco thought about green dresses and boundaries respected. About a woman who looked at him and saw not power or danger or opportunity, but just a man who might, if he tried hard enough, be worth her time. No, he admitted. But I'm doing it anyway. The background check took 3 days to clear, which Marco knew because he'd called twice to confirm it was processing. Luca had given him a look the second time, the kind that said his boss was acting like someone he didn't recognize, but wisely kept his mouth shut. The training session was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the community center, a squat brick building that looked like it had been standing since the neighborhood's better days and had stubbornly refused to give up even as everything around it deteriorated. Marco arrived 15 minutes early, alone, in a car that he'd specifically chosen for being unremarkable. No driver, no Luca, hovering in the background. Just him in a building full of people who were about to teach him how to help someone read. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on him. He'd built an empire on reading people, on understanding what they wanted and what they feared, on knowing which words would open doors and which would close them permanently. But sitting in a classroom with 11 other volunteers while a woman named Patricia explained phonics methodology, he felt wildly out of his depth. Ava wasn't there. He'd known she wouldn't be. This was volunteer training, and she was staff, but he'd still found himself looking for her face among the others gathered in the too-bright room with motivational posters peeling at the corners. Reading isn't just about decoding letters, Patricia was saying. She had the patient, weathered look of someone who'd been doing this work for decades and had long ago stopped expecting praise for it. It's about giving someone access to the world, every form they can't fill out, every sign they can't read, every email they have to ask someone else to interpret. That's a moment of shame, of dependence, of being less than whole. We're not teaching reading, we're teaching independence. Marco found himself actually listening, actually taking notes on the packet they'd provided. Around him, the other volunteers were a mix: college students fulfilling service requirements, retirees looking for purpose, a couple of people who looked like they'd been where these students were and wanted to give back. No one seemed to recognize him, which was either a testament to how far outside his usual circles he'd wandered, or evidence that his reputation didn't extend as far as he'd thought. He wasn't sure which possibility was more unsettling. The training covered assessment techniques, teaching strategies, how to handle frustration, both the students and your own. They role-played scenarios. Marco found himself paired with a college student named Amy, who was so nervous she kept apologizing every time she made a mistake in the exercise. "You're doing fine," he told her, surprised to find he meant it. "We're all learning." After 2 hours, Patricia dismissed them with homework. Yes, apparently even volunteer tutors got homework, and a reminder that their first sessions would be observed. Marco was gathering his materials when a familiar voice came from the doorway. "So you actually showed up." Ava was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, wearing jeans and a community center staff shirt that had seen better days. Her hair was in a braid, and she looked tired in a way that suggested this had been a long day before he'd even arrived. "I said I would." He crossed to her, aware of Patricia watching with interest from across the room. "Was there doubt?" "Honestly, yes." She pushed off from the doorframe. "Men like you don't usually follow through on things that don't benefit them directly." "Maybe I'm not like most men." "Maybe." She didn't sound convinced. "Walk with me?" They ended up in a small office that Ava apparently shared with 2 other tutors, based on the 3 desks crammed into a space meant for one. She dropped into a chair that squeaked in protest and gestured for him to take the other. "So Patricia says you were engaged and asked good questions," Ava said. "Color me surprised." "Why surprised?" "Because this isn't your world, Marco. This is small and slow, and you don't get to control the outcome. People learn at their own pace. Sometimes they don't learn at all. Sometimes they disappear for 3 weeks because life got in the way, and you just have to accept it." She was watching him carefully. "That doesn't seem like something you're built for." She wasn't wrong. Everything in his life was built on control, on making outcomes happen, rather than waiting for them to develop. But something about the challenge in her voice made him want to prove her wrong. "Try me." "I am." She pulled a file from the desk. "I have a student for you if you're serious." "I'm serious." His name is Marcus Wright. He's 43, works in maintenance at a hotel downtown. He can read at about a 3rd grade level, which means he can get by in most situations, but can't do anything that requires real comprehension. He wants to take the civil service exam so he can get a better city job. She slid the file across. He's been on the waiting list for 7 months. Marco opened the file. The intake form showed a man who'd dropped out of school in 9th grade, who'd been working since he was 15, who had 3 kids and a wife, and had somehow made it through 2 decades of adult life while barely being able to read. The assessment notes were technical, but Marco could read between the lines. This was going to be hard work, with no guarantee of success. When do I start? Thursday afternoons, if that still works for you. 1-hour sessions. She paused. He knows who you are, by the way. I don't lie to my students. He knows you're wealthy, that you're connected, that people say things about you. He's willing to work with you anyway because he's desperate and we're out of options. The honesty of it landed like a punch. Fair enough. Marco, her voice had gone serious. If you're doing this to get close to me, if this is some kind of elaborate play, it's not. He met her eyes. I mean, yes, I want to see you again. I'm not going to pretend that's not part of why I'm here. But if I'm going to do this, I'm going to actually do it. Not half-assed. Not as a performance. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. Thursday at 3. Don't be late. And Marco? If you waste Marcus's time, if you treat this like it's beneath you or like you're doing him some kind of favor, I will personally make sure you regret it. The threat should have been funny coming from a woman who barely reached his shoulder. Instead, it was one of the most attractive things anyone had said to him in years. Understood. Thursday came too slowly and too fast at the same time. Marco caught himself nervous, actually nervous, in a way he hadn't been since his first real collection job at 19. He'd faced down armed men, negotiated with people who'd cheerfully kill him if the numbers worked out, built an empire on reading situations and exploiting weaknesses. But sitting in a community center classroom waiting for Marcus Wright to arrive, his palms were sweating. Marcus showed up 5 minutes early. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and work-worn, with hands that spoke of decades of physical labor. He shook Marco's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, and his eyes held the kind of wariness of someone who'd learned to be careful about who he trusted. Mr. Duca. Marco, please. He gestured to the chairs Patricia had set up for them. Thanks for giving me a chance. Miss Collins says you're serious about this. Marcus sat, his body language careful. That true? It's true. Why? The question was direct, no hostility, but no acceptance either. You got money. You got power. What you need with teaching someone like me to read. Marco could have deflected, could have given some easy answer about community service or giving back. Instead, he found himself being honest. Because someone I respect thinks I should, and because I'm tired of only doing things I'm already good at. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Fair enough. He pulled out a workbook that had clearly seen better days. So where do we start? They started with an assessment which mostly confirmed what the intake form had said. Marcus could sound out simple words but struggled with anything beyond basic phonics. Comprehension was harder. He could read individual sentences but lost the thread when things got more complex. This is embarrassing, Marcus said after stumbling through a paragraph about weather patterns. I'm 43 years old, and I read like a kid. You read like someone who's teaching himself, Marco corrected. That's different. He meant it. Watching Marcus work through the material, seeing the concentration on his face, the frustration when things didn't click, it was humbling in a way Marco hadn't expected. They worked through the hour. By the end, Marcus had successfully read 3 short passages and answered comprehension questions about 2 of them. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Same time next week? Marco asked as they packed up. Marcus hesitated. You really gonna keep coming? This ain't a one-time thing? I really am. Why should I believe you? It was a good question. Marco thought about all the promises he'd made and kept in his life, all the deals he'd honored because his word was the only currency that mattered in his world. But this was different. This was smaller and somehow more important. You shouldn't, he said finally. Not until I prove it. So let me prove it. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right then, next Thursday. Marco walked out of that session feeling like he'd accomplished something, though he couldn't have said exactly what. In the hallway, he found Ava waiting, leaning against the wall with a clipboard and that expression of careful assessment he was starting to recognize. How'd it go? He's smart, he's motivated, and I have no idea what I'm doing. Marco surprised himself by admitting it. That's honest. She pushed off from the wall. Want some coffee? There's a place around the corner that's terrible but convenient. It wasn't a date. She made that clear by bringing her work with her, by choosing a table near the window in full view of everyone passing by. But it was time, and Marco was learning to take what he could get. The coffee was indeed terrible. They drank it anyway. So Marcus liked you, Ava said, reviewing notes on her clipboard. Or at least he didn't ask to switch tutors, which from him is basically a ringing endorsement. Glad I passed the test. Don't get cocky, you've had one session. But she was smiling slightly as she said it. Patricia says you actually did the homework. I said I was serious. People say a lot of things. She set down the clipboard. Why are you really doing this, Marco? There it was again, the question he kept being asked, the answer he kept not quite being able to articulate. Because of you felt too simple and too complicated at the same time. Because I want to be different felt like a lie, even though it might have been true. Because I spent 20 years building something, he said slowly, working it out as he spoke. And now I'm wondering what it was for. Money? Power? The ability to walk into any room and have people afraid of me? He shook his head. I'm tired of being feared. I want to be useful. To who? To anyone. To Marcus. To your students. To... He stopped himself before saying to you. But Ava heard it anyway. He saw it in the way her expression shifted, something guarded coming into her eyes. Marco, I need to be clear about something. Here it came. The boundary, the line, the moment where she'd tell him this couldn't be whatever he was hoping it might become. I'm listening. I'm not interested in dating you. She said it gently but firmly. I don't date men in your world. I don't date men with your kind of power. I've seen what happens when regular people get involved with people who operate outside the rules, and it never ends well. I understand. He did, even if he didn't like it. But, she continued, and his attention sharpened, if you keep showing up, if you actually help Marcus learn to read, if you prove you're serious about this, maybe we can be friends. Friends. It was the smallest offering imaginable, and somehow felt like a victory anyway. I can work with friends. Can you? She was watching him carefully. Because I mean real friends, Marco. Not the kind where you're waiting for me to change my mind. Not the kind where every conversation is loaded with expectation. Just friends who respect each other and share coffee sometimes. He should have walked away. Should have recognized this for what it was, a door closing, a possibility ending before it had really begun. But something in her voice, some thread of hope that he might actually be capable of what she was describing, made him nod. Real friends. I can do that. We'll see. She gathered her things. Same time next week? I want to check in after your second session with Marcus. It's a date. He caught her look. A friend date. A completely platonic check-in between colleagues. You're going to be annoying about this, aren't you? Probably. Her laugh was surprised and genuine, and Marco filed it away as another small victory. The next 3 weeks fell into a pattern. Thursday afternoons with Marcus, who slowly, painfully, began to make progress. The civil service exam prep materials were brutal, dense paragraphs about city ordinances and procedures, but Marcus attacked them with a determination that made Marco's own work ethic look lazy. My youngest, Marcus said during their fourth session, she's in third grade. She reads better than I do. Last week she tried to help me with something and He stopped, shook his head. I don't want her growing up ashamed of her father. Marco didn't have good words for that, so he just nodded and they kept working. After each session, he'd find Ava. Sometimes for coffee, sometimes just walking around the neighborhood while she told him about her other students, about the challenges of running a literacy program with funding that never quite covered needs. He learned that she'd been doing this for 6 years, that she'd burned out twice and come back anyway, that she believed in this work with a ferocity that was almost religious. He learned other things too, that she was funny when she forgot to be guarded, that she had a brother in Seattle she worried about, and a mother who called too much and not enough simultaneously, that she'd been engaged once, to a man who'd wanted her to be smaller, quieter, more convenient, and she'd walked away 6 months before the wedding. Best decision I ever made, she said, sitting on a bench outside the community center while evening came down around them. Worst 6 months of my life, but the best decision. What happened? I realized I was making myself less so he could feel like more. dimming my own light so he wouldn't feel outshone. She looked at him. I swore I'd never do that again. For anyone. Good. Marco meant it. You shouldn't. That's why I can't date you, you know. Men like you, you're used to being the biggest thing in the room. I don't want to spend my life managing someone else's ego. It stung because it was partially true. Marco was used to being the center of gravity, the one around whom things orbited. But he was also learning, slowly, awkwardly, that there were other ways to be. What if I don't want you to be smaller, he asked. What if I want to be around someone who's already bright? Then we can be friends. She stood, brushing off her jeans. Real ones. And that's all. He was starting to believe she might mean it. The first sign that his two worlds were colliding came on a Tuesday morning during a meeting with a contractor who was funneling money through one of Marco's construction firms. The man's phone rang mid-sentence, and he glanced at it, went pale, and excused himself with an urgency that made Marco's instincts flare. Problem? Marco asked when the man returned 5 minutes later, visibly shaken. No problem. Just family thing. But his hands were trembling as he picked up the contract they'd been reviewing. Marco let it go in the moment. But afterward, he had Luca look into it, because men didn't go pale and shake over family things, not in his experience. What Luca found was interesting. The contractor had a gambling debt. Not with Marco's people. They'd gotten out of that business years ago when the margins stopped making sense. But with someone operating out of the East Side. Someone who was apparently using aggressive collection methods that included threatening family members. Marco should have left it alone. It wasn't his business, wasn't his problem, wasn't his concern how other people ran their operations. But he found himself thinking about Marcus, about third-grade daughters who read better than their fathers, about the look on the contractor's face when that call had come through. He made a call, had a conversation. Made it clear that the contractor was under his protection and that extending that debt would be considered a personal insult, the kind of insult that had consequences. It was a small thing, barely a blip in the larger ecosystem of his world. But it felt different than the other choices he made, the other times he'd intervened in situations that didn't directly benefit him. He didn't mention it to Ava, didn't need her to know that part of his life was still operating exactly as it always had, even if the reasons were starting to shift. The second sign came that Thursday when he arrived at the community center to find Ava in her office, staring at a piece of paper with an expression he couldn't quite read. What's wrong? She looked up, startled. Nothing. Just someone sent a donation, a big one. How big? Enough to fully fund the literacy program for the next 3 years. She handed him the letter. Anonymous donor. Came through a law firm downtown. Marco took the letter, already knowing what he'd find. The law firm was one he'd used before, for exactly this kind of thing. The amount, $300,000, was substantial, but not outrageous. Someone had decided to take him up on that initial conversation about funding, but they'd gone through channels he recognized. That's great, he said, carefully neutral. That solves a lot of problems, right? It does. But she was still watching him with that assessing look. You wouldn't know anything about this, would you? The lie would have been easy, but he'd been trying to be honest with her, or at least as honest as he could be without exposing things that would make her run. What makes you think I would? Because you're the only person I've talked to in the last month who could write a check that size without blinking. And because this firm, she tapped the letterhead, I looked them up. They specialize in private wealth management and estate planning, not exactly the typical anonymous charity route. She was smart. He'd known that, but this was evidence of exactly how smart, how good she was at putting pieces together. If I did know something about it, he said carefully, would you be angry? I don't know. She set down the letter. Are you trying to buy me, Marco? No. That much he could say with certainty. I'm trying to help your students. There's a difference. Is there? But her voice had lost some of its edge. Because from where I'm sitting, this feels like you're trying to prove something. Maybe I am. He sat down across from her. You told me to be useful. This is useful. 20 students get tutors instead of staying on a waiting list. That's what matters, right? She was quiet for a long time, conflict playing across her face. Finally, she sighed. You're manipulative, you know that? I've been told. And you can't just throw money at problems and expect them to go away. I know that too. But you're right, this helps people. She looked at him, really looked, like she was trying to see through him to whatever was underneath. Thank you. If it was you, which I'm not saying it was. Of course not. They held each other's gaze, and something passed between them, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of it. The foundation that trust could be built on, given time and proof and consistency. Marcus made a breakthrough this week, Ava said, changing the subject. Patricia observed your session. She said she's never seen him that engaged. He's doing the work. I'm just there. You're more than just there, Marco. You're actually good at this. She said it like it surprised her. You're patient with him. You celebrate the small wins. You don't make him feel stupid when he struggles. Why would I? He's trying to learn something most people take for granted. That takes courage. See? That's what I don't understand about you. She leaned forward. You say things like that, things that suggest you actually understand what it means to struggle, what it costs to try and fail and try again. But then you're also the guy who... She stopped, but he knew how the sentence ended. The guy who runs an empire built on control and fear and money that doesn't always come from legal sources. I'm both, he said quietly. I know that's not a comfortable answer, but it's the truth. How do you live with that? Honestly, I'm not sure I do. Not well, anyway. It was more honesty than he'd intended, but something about this moment, this conversation, demanded it. I'm trying to figure out who I want to be beyond what I've already built. That's part of why I'm here. And the other part? The other part is you. He said it simply, without expectation. I like who I am when I'm around you. I like the person you make me want to be. Ava's expression was unreadable. For a moment he thought he'd miscalculated, pushed too far, revealed too much. Then she smiled, small and sad and somehow kind all at once. We're still just friends, Marco. I know. But they're good friends. She stood, gathering her things. Come on, that terrible coffee place is calling our names. They walked to the coffee shop through streets that were starting to feel familiar. Marco found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. The bodega on the corner, where Mrs. Chen always had fresh flowers. The playground where kids played until streetlights came on. The church with the community garden that someone tended with obvious love. This had been his neighborhood once, before he'd moved to the kind of address that came with doormen and views. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of a community rather than someone who controlled it from above. What are you thinking? Ava asked as they waited for their coffee. That I'd forgotten what this felt like. What felt like? Being normal. Being just some guy getting coffee with a friend. He looked at her. It's nice. It is normal, Marco. This is what regular people do. I'm not regular people. Maybe you could be, if you wanted to. The suggestion hung between them, impossible and tempting in equal measure. Marco wasn't sure he could be normal even if he tried. His world didn't allow for normal. Normal people didn't have Luca checking in every few hours to make sure no one had tried to kill them. Normal people didn't have lawyers on retainer for situations that couldn't be explained to police. Normal people didn't lie awake at night calculating which associates might be planning betrayals and how to neutralize them before they became threats. But sitting in this terrible coffee shop with Ava, watching her smile at something on her phone, he could almost imagine it. Could almost see a version of himself that wasn't defined by power and control, that measured success by different metrics, that built something besides an empire. Maybe, he said. She looked up, and something in her expression suggested she understood what that admission cost him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Marco let himself exist in the moment rather than calculating 3 moves ahead. It was harder than it should have been, turning off the part of his brain that was always strategizing, always planning, always looking for angles and opportunities. But he was learning. His phone buzzed. Luca with a message that made his stomach drop. We have a problem. Call me. Marco excused himself, stepping outside to make the call. What kind of problem? The East Side thing, the gambling debt. Luca's voice was tight. They're not backing off. They're pushing harder, making an example. Of who? The contractor's daughter. They grabbed her after school. She's safe. They let her go after an hour. But the message was clear. Marco's hand tightened around the phone. Where are they? Boss, you need to think about this. You go to war over someone else's contractor, it sends a message. People will think you're getting soft, getting involved in things that don't concern you. Where are they? Luca sighed and gave him an address. Marco ended the call and stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of two worlds pulling him in opposite directions. He could go back inside, finish his coffee with Ava, keep playing at being normal. Or he could handle this the way he'd always handled problems, directly, definitively, with the kind of force that made sure the message was received. The choice shouldn't have been difficult. But standing there so close to the warmth of that coffee shop and everything it represented, Marco found himself hesitating. Then he thought about Marcus's daughter, about third graders who read better than their fathers, about how easy it was for powerful people to hurt vulnerable ones just because they could. He went back inside. I have to go. Something came up. Ava's expression shifted immediately. Is everything okay? It will be. He hoped that was true. I'll see you next Thursday? Marco. She stood, and he saw real concern in her eyes. Be careful, whatever this is. I will. He walked away before she could ask more questions, before he had to lie or tell truth that would destroy whatever they were building between them. Outside, his car was already waiting. Luca had anticipated his choice, which shouldn't have surprised him. Luca always knew. You sure about this? Luca asked as they drove. Marco watched the neighborhood blur past, leaving behind the community center and the terrible coffee shop and the possibility of being someone different. No, but I'm doing it anyway. Because some problems couldn't be solved with patience and tutoring and slow progress toward being a better person. Some problems required being exactly who he'd always been, powerful, dangerous, and willing to make sure the right people were afraid of the right things. Even if it meant the woman he was trying to be better for would never fully understand why. The address led to a warehouse in a part of the city that Marco knew better than he wanted to admit. This was old territory, the kind of place where business happened in cash and consequences, where nobody called the police because the police wouldn't come anyway. Luca parked 2 blocks away. You want backup? No. Marco checked his reflection in the side mirror, adjusting his tie. This needs to be just me. More people makes it a war. One person makes it a conversation. A conversation where you might get shot. They won't shoot me. Marco was fairly certain of this. Fairly. They're making money off that gambling operation. Shooting me starts a war they can't win, and they know it. And if you're wrong, then you'll have a lot of explaining to do to everyone who thinks I've gone soft. Marco opened the door. Stay here. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, call Ricci. He didn't wait for Luca's response. 20 minutes was more than enough time for this to go sideways, and if it did, Ricci would know what to do. The old man had been handling Marco's problems since Marco was 19 and stupid enough to think violence was always the answer. The warehouse door wasn't locked. That was the first sign this was either a trap or they were expecting him. Marco stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. The space was mostly empty. A few crates, some equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and 3 men standing near a makeshift office in the back. 2 of them were muscle, obvious, and interchangeable. The third was older, maybe 50, with the kind of worn face that came from decades of making bad choices and living with them. He looked up as Marco approached, and something like resignation crossed his features. Duca. You know who I am. Good. Saves time. Marco stopped a careful distance away, close enough to talk but far enough to move if he needed to. We need to discuss your collection methods. This ain't your business. But the man's voice lacked conviction. You made it my business when you grabbed a kid to make a point. Marco kept his tone conversational, almost friendly. I told you the contractor was under my protection. I thought I was clear. You were clear, but I got debts to collect, and your contractor owes me 50 grand. What am I supposed to do? Just eat it? You're supposed to remember that money's not worth dying over. The threat hung in the air between them. One of the muscle guys shifted his weight, hand moving toward his jacket, but the older man stopped him with a look. You threatening me in my own place? I'm offering you a choice. Marco pulled an envelope from his inside pocket and tossed it onto the desk between them. There's 50 grand in there. We're buying the debt. As of now, the contractor doesn't owe you anything. The man stared at the envelope like it might explode. Why would you do that? It was a good question. Marco could have given a dozen practical answers, protecting his interests, maintaining his reputation, sending a message about what happened to people who ignored his warnings. All of them would have been true. But standing there in a warehouse that smelled like old oil and poor decisions, thinking about Ava's face when she'd told him to be careful, he found himself giving the real answer. Because I'm tired of kids getting hurt to make adults feel powerful. The older man studied him for a long moment, then picked up the envelope and counted the money inside. This clears the debt? Completely. You never contact the contractor again. You never go near his family. And you remember that crossing me has consequences that aren't worth any amount of money. Marco held his gaze. We clear? Yeah, we're clear. Marco turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. If I hear about you grabbing any more kids, debt or no debt, we're going to have a different kind of conversation. The kind that doesn't end with envelopes of cash. He didn't wait for a response. The muscle guys parted to let him through, and Marco walked out of that warehouse feeling like he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd solved the problem, but not the way he was trying to solve problems now, not with patience and process and legal channels. He'd solved it the old way, with money and threats and the implicit violence that backed up both. Luca was waiting by the car, checking his watch. 18 minutes. You're getting faster. Let's go. They drove in silence for a while before Luca said, That was the right call, sending the message. Was it? Marco watched the city pass by. Or did I just prove I can't actually change? Why do you need to change? It was a fair question. Marco had built something impressive, something that worked, something that provided for a lot of people, even if the methods weren't always clean. Why mess with that for a woman who'd made it clear she wasn't interested in dating him? For a tutoring job that paid nothing and helped one person at a time? Because I want to sleep at night, Marco said finally. I want to be someone I don't hate when I look in the mirror. Luca was quiet for a moment. You're a good man, boss. You always have been. You just operate in a world that doesn't reward being good. Maybe I'm in the wrong world then. Maybe. Or maybe you're finally figuring out how to operate in both. Marco thought about that as they drove back toward his office. Operating in both worlds. Being the man who could walk into a warehouse and solve problems with cash and threats, and also the man who showed up every Thursday to help Marcus Wright learn to read. He wasn't sure those two men could coexist in the same person without one eventually destroying the other, but he was going to try anyway. Thursday came again. Marco showed up early to the community center, half expecting Ava to have heard somehow about what he'd done, to look at him differently, to finally see past the tutoring volunteer to the man underneath who still solved problems with power instead of patience. But when she arrived, her smile was the same as always, cautiously warm, genuinely pleased to see him. How's Marcus doing? Good. He finished the first practice exam. Marco pulled out his notes. He passed. Not by much, but he passed. That's huge. Ava's face lit up in a way that made something in Marco's chest tighten. That's months ahead of schedule. He's motivated, and he's smart. He just needed someone to believe he could do it. You're good at that, you know. She said it like it surprised her. Making people believe they can do hard things. If only she knew. If only she could see that most of his career had been built on making people believe the opposite. That crossing him was impossible. That fighting back was futile. That the smart play was always to give him what he wanted and hope he left them alone. Marcus arrived then, saving Marco from having to respond. They settled into their usual spots, and Marcus pulled out materials with the kind of careful pride that suggested he'd been practicing at home. My wife's been helping, Marcus admitted as they started working through a reading passage. She's been reading with me at night, says it's like when we first met and I used to read her poetry. You read poetry? Used to make it up, mostly. Couldn't write it down, but I could say it. Marcus smiled at the memory. She fell for a smooth-talking maintenance man who promised her the moon and delivered a studio apartment and 3 kids. Sounds like she got a good deal. She says so, even now, when I can barely help the kids with homework and she's got to handle all the paperwork and I can't. He stopped, shook his head. She says I'm worth the trouble. I want to make sure she's right. They worked through the passage, Marcus stumbling over words like ordinance and municipality, but fighting through them with a determination that made Marco's throat tight. This was what progress looked like up close. Not smooth or easy or particularly pretty, but real and hard-won and meaningful in ways that closing a $3 million deal never would be. After the session, Marco found Ava in her office again, this time staring at her computer screen with a frown that suggested bad news. "What's wrong?" She looked up, startled. "Nothing, just, we got a complaint." "About?" "About you." She turned the screen so he could see the email. It was from someone named Richard Chen, claiming that having someone like Marco Duca volunteering at a community center sent the wrong message to children, that his reputation made him unsuitable for working with vulnerable populations, that the center should reconsider his involvement. Marco read it twice, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. "I see. It's one complaint." Ava closed the email. "And honestly, I think it's from Richard Chen, the city councilman, who's probably just trying to score political points by going after you. He's not wrong, though." "Excuse me?" "About my reputation. About what I am." Marco met her eyes. "You know what people say about me. Some of it's probably true." "Probably?" She studied his face. "So which parts are true, Marco?" This was the moment. He could deflect, could give her enough truth to satisfy without revealing anything that would make her run. Or he could be honest, really honest, and let her decide if she could live with who he actually was. "I'm not a good man, Ava. I've done things I'm not proud of. I've hurt people. I've broken laws. I've built my business on—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "On activities that exist in gray areas the law doesn't always reach." "Are you telling me you're a criminal?" "I'm telling you I'm complicated." It was a coward's answer, and they both knew it. "I'm telling you that yes, there are parts of my life that wouldn't look good in daylight, but I'm also telling you that this," he gestured around the office, "this isn't performance. I'm not here to rehabilitate my image. I'm here because I want to be better than I've been." Ava was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "Are you dangerous?" "To some people. Not to you, never to you or anyone here." "How can you be sure?" "Because I choose to be." Marco held her gaze. "Because I'm learning that power isn't just about what you can take or destroy. It's also about what you choose to protect." She looked at him like she was trying to see through skin and bone to whatever was underneath. "I should ask you to leave. Richard Chen is right. Having you here is complicated and probably sends the wrong message and could cause problems down the line. But Marcus is learning to read for the first time in his life because you show up every week and treat him like he matters. And that anonymous donation is going to help 20 more people do the same thing. And you look at this work like it's important, like it's not beneath you, even though you could be anywhere else doing anything else." She shook her head. "So I'm not going to ask you to leave. But I am going to ask you to be honest with me from now on. Real honest. Not the careful version you've been giving me." "Okay." Marco's heart was pounding. "What do you want to know? Are you involved in anything that could put my students at risk?" "No." "Are you going to use this center or these people for anything besides actually helping them?" "No." "If someone from your other life showed up here, would you handle it in a way that kept everyone safe?" "Yes." He said it with absolute certainty because that much he could promise. Whatever it took. Ava studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay. Then we're good. For now." "For now," Marco agreed, knowing it was the best he could hope for. They fell back into their routine after that, but something had shifted. Ava watched him more carefully now, like she was waiting to see if his promises would hold. Marco found himself being extra careful, extra conscious of keeping his two worlds separate. But worlds have a way of colliding no matter how carefully you try to keep them apart. It started small. A car that showed up outside the community center on a Thursday, expensive and out of place, idling at the curb. Marco noticed it but didn't think much of it. Could have been anyone, waiting for anyone. Then it was there again the next week. Same car, same spot, same driver, who didn't get out, but clearly wasn't going anywhere. The third week, Marcus noticed it too. "That car's been there every time I come here now. You know anything about that?" Marco did, because he'd had Luca run the plates after the second appearance. The car belonged to Victor's operation. The same Victor who'd been at Elevation the night Marco met Ava, who'd made comments about her that Marco hadn't liked, who'd apparently decided that Marco's involvement with a community center was either weakness to exploit or leverage to gain. It's nothing, Marco told Marcus. Just someone who doesn't know when to mind their own business. But it wasn't nothing, and it got less nothing when Ava's apartment building got a delivery she didn't order. Flowers with no card, expensive and vaguely threatening in their anonymity. Then her car got a flat tire in the community center parking lot. Not slashed, just mysteriously flat, like maybe someone had let the air out while she was inside teaching. Small things, deniable things, the kind of pressure tactics that were designed to send a message without crossing a line into anything actionable. Marco knew the playbook because he'd used it himself. Make someone uncomfortable. Make them wonder if they're safe. Make them question every shadow and every coincidence until they're looking over their shoulder constantly. He called Victor on a Friday evening after Ava had mentioned the flat tire with forced casualness that didn't hide her worry. "We need to talk." "About?" Victor's voice was all innocence. "About why your people are watching the Westside Community Center. About why someone's sending flowers to addresses they shouldn't know. About why you're suddenly interested in how I spend my Thursday afternoons. Just looking out for you, Marco, making sure you're not getting distracted by things that don't matter." "Things that don't matter to you," Marco corrected. "But they matter to me, which means you need to back off." "Or what?" Now the innocence was gone, replaced by calculation. "You going to start a war over a tutor? Over some nobody who teaches people to read?" The dismissiveness in Victor's voice made Marco's jaw clench. "She's not nobody, and yes, if I have to." "That's what I thought." Victor sounded almost pleased. "You're getting soft, Duca, getting involved in things that make you vulnerable. People are noticing. Let them notice. They're also noticing that you're protecting contractors who owe money to other operations, stepping into situations that aren't your concern, acting like you're trying to clean up your act." Victor paused. "Some people think you might be working with the feds, building a case, getting ready to flip." Marco's blood went cold. That accusation, in his world, was as good as a death sentence. It didn't matter if it was true. Once people started wondering, once the doubt was planted, every action got reinterpreted through that lens. That's a dangerous thing to suggest. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what people are saying, and I'm telling you that if you want those rumors to stop, you need to remember where your loyalties lie, which means stepping back from whatever crusade you're on and focusing on actual business. Or things are going to get complicated for you, and for the people you care about." The line went dead. Marco stood there holding his phone, feeling the walls of his two worlds pressing in from both sides. He could give Victor what he wanted. Step back from the community center, stop seeing Ava, go back to being the Marco Duca everyone expected. The rumors would die down. The pressure would ease. Life would go back to the predictable patterns of power and control. Or he could refuse. Could keep showing up on Thursdays, keep having terrible coffee with Ava, keep trying to be someone different than he'd always been, and deal with whatever consequences Victor and the others who thought like him decided to impose. It shouldn't have been a hard choice. Everything Marco had built, everything he'd worked for, everything that kept him alive in a world where weakness got you killed. All of it pointed toward giving in, backing off, preserving what mattered in the hierarchy of things that actually mattered. But standing there in his office, looking out at a city that stretched in all directions like a kingdom he'd conquered but never really ruled, Marco found himself thinking about Marcus reading to his daughter, about Ava's face when she talked about her students, about the version of himself he saw reflected in her eyes, flawed and complicated but actually trying, to be better. He called Luca. "We need to move on, Victor. Not violence, legal channels. Find everything we can, tax evasion, labor violations, construction code problems, everything that'll stand up in court." "Boss, that's going to take time. And it's going to make things worse before they get better." "I know, do it anyway." "What about the tutor, the community center?" Marco thought about that. The smart play was to distance himself, to make it clear Ava wasn't leverage, wasn't important, wasn't worth protecting. But that would mean abandoning Marcus mid-program, would mean breaking promises he'd actually meant to keep, would mean proving that Ava had been right all along, that he was just like every other powerful man who put himself first. "Increase security around the center, subtle. I don't want Ava or the students to notice, but I want to know if anyone so much as looks at that building wrong." He paused. "And get me a meeting with Ricci. It's time to call in some favors." He spent the weekend preparing. Ricci, when they met, listened to the whole situation with the patience of someone who'd seen every variation of this story play out over 5 decades in the business. "You're in love with her," Ricci said when Marco finished. "I'm not—" Marco stopped because denying it felt like lying. "It's complicated." "It's not complicated. You're in love with a woman who makes you want to be better than you are, and that's threatening everything you've built because everything you've built was made by the man you're trying not to be anymore." Ricci poured them both whiskey. "That's not complicated. That's just hard." "What do I do?" "You decide what matters more, the empire or the woman, the power or the possibility, the life you have or the life you want." Ricci raised his glass. "And then you accept that whatever you choose, you're going to lose something you can't get back." Marco didn't want to choose, wanted to believe he could have both, could keep his position and his power while also being the kind of man Ava could respect. But Ricci was right. The two things were pulling in opposite directions, and eventually something would have to give. Thursday came again. Marco showed up at his community center knowing that Victor's people might be watching, that every moment he spent there was ammunition for rumors that could get him killed. He showed up anyway. Marcus was already waiting, practically vibrating with excitement. "I got the test results back from the practice civil service exam." "And?" "I passed. Not practice, the real thing. I took it last week, and I passed." Marcus's eyes were bright. "I'm eligible for the jobs now, city maintenance positions. Better pay, better benefits, better everything." The joy in his voice, the pride in his face, it was worth every rumor, every threat, every complication Victor could throw at him. "Marcus, that's incredible. I'm proud of you." "Couldn't have done it without you, man. Couldn't have even tried." Marcus stuck out his hand, and when Marco shook it, the grip was firm and grateful, and said more than words could. After the session, Marco found Ava in the hallway, talking with Patricia about scheduling. She looked tired, shadows under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Can we talk?" Marco asked when Patricia left. They ended up in her office, door closed, the space feeling smaller than usual. "Something's wrong," Ava said. "You've been different the last few weeks, distracted. And that car outside, I'm handling it." "Handling what, Marco?" She stood, frustration making her voice sharp. "I'm not stupid. I know something's going on. I know that your being here has somehow made things complicated in your other life. And I know you're not telling me because you think I can't handle it, or it'll scare me off, or whatever protective thing you've convinced yourself is noble." She was right about all of it. Marco took a breath. "There are people in my world who think I'm getting weak, soft. They think my being here, my caring about this," he gestured around the office, "makes me vulnerable. And they're using that, applying pressure, testing to see if I'll back down. And will you? No. Even if it costs you? Even then." He met her eyes. "But I need to know if you want me to. If having me here is putting you and your students at risk, I'll walk away. I don't want to, but I will." Ava was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions Marco couldn't quite name. Finally, she said, "Do you know what my students tell me? They tell me that having you here gives them hope. Not because you're rich or powerful or connected, because you show up. Because someone like you thinks they're worth your time." She moved closer. "So no, I don't want you to walk away. I want you to figure out how to be both things, the man who helps Marcus and the man who handles whatever's happening in your other world. And I want you to do it without anyone getting hurt." "I'm trying." "I know, I can see it." She reached out and, for the first time, touched his arm. Just a hand on his sleeve, but it felt like more. "Just promise me you'll be careful, and that if things get dangerous, you'll tell me. No more protecting me from information I should have." "I promise." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he made it anyway because the alternative was watching her walk away, and that felt like losing something essential. His phone buzzed, a text from Luca. "Victor's making moves. Need you back here." Marco looked at Ava, at her hand still resting on his arm, at the worry in her eyes that she was trying to hide. "I have to go." "Be careful, Marco, please." He wanted to kiss her. Wanted to pull her close and promise her everything would be fine, and that he'd figure out how to keep both worlds from collapsing. Instead, he just nodded and left, feeling her watching him go. In the car, Luca filled him in. Victor had called a meeting, not a request, a summons, with several of the major players in the organization. The kind of meeting where alliances were tested and loyalties were questioned and people who showed up wrong sometimes didn't leave at all. "You don't have to go," Luca said. "We can handle this other ways." But they both knew that was a lie. In their world, not showing up to a summons was as good as admitting guilt. It was the kind of weakness that got you killed, or worse. "Set it up, tomorrow night." Marco watched the city stream past. "And Luca? Make sure someone's watching the community center. Anyone goes near it, I want to know." "Already done, boss." Of course it was. Luca had been 3 steps ahead of him since this whole thing started, anticipating moves Marco was only just beginning to make. That night, Marco sat in his apartment, his real apartment, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that cost more than most people made in a year, and thought about choices and consequences, about the life he'd built and the life he wanted, about Ava's face when she'd asked him to be careful, like she actually cared if he made it through whatever was coming. His phone rang, unknown number, which usually meant trouble. "Duca. Mr. Duca, this is Jennifer Park from the Westside Community Center." Her voice was professional but urgent. "I wanted to let you know we got another complaint, this time from someone claiming to have evidence of criminal activity involving our volunteers." Marco's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of evidence?" "They didn't specify, just said they were going to the licensing board and that they had proof one of our volunteers was using the center for illegal purposes." She paused. "I don't believe it, but I wanted you to know in case it was about me." "Yes." "Thank you for calling." Marco ended the conversation and sat there, feeling the net tighten around him. Victor wasn't just applying pressure anymore. He was building a case, manufacturing evidence, creating problems that would force Marco to either defend himself publicly or walk away quietly. It was smart. It was exactly what Marco would have done in Victor's position, which meant he knew exactly how dangerous this was about to get. Marco spent the night making calls, not to his usual network of associates and fixers, but to the other contacts he'd carefully cultivated over the years, the legitimate ones, lawyers who specialized in nonprofit law, investigators who worked clean cases, people who operated in daylight and could stand up to scrutiny. By morning, he had a plan. It wasn't the kind of plan that involved warehouses and envelopes of cash. It was slower, more methodical, the kind of thing that required patience he wasn't sure he had. But it was legal, and that mattered now in a way it never had before. Luca arrived at 7 with coffee and a folder full of research. Victor's been busy. He's got city inspectors lined up to audit the community center, claims of financial irregularities, the whole playbook. He's trying to shut the place down. He won't succeed. Marco opened the folder, scanning the documents. "Not if we move first." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we go completely transparent. Full financial disclosure, independent audit, media coverage. Make the center so clean and so visible that any attack on it looks like exactly what it is, a hit job." Luca whistled low. "That's going to shine a spotlight on everything, including your involvement." "I know. Boss, if the press starts digging into why you're volunteering there, they're going to find Ava. They're going to make assumptions, write stories, turn this into something it's not." Marco had thought of that too, had spent half the night weighing Ava's privacy against the center's survival. "Then we make sure the story they write is the right one. A businessman giving back to his old neighborhood, supporting literacy programs. Nothing scandalous, nothing that ties her to me beyond professional collaboration." "You really think they'll buy that?" "No, but I think they'll print it if we give them something better to focus on. And I think Victor will back off once he realizes attacking the center means attacking something the public actually cares about." It was a gamble. Everything about this situation was a gamble. But Marco was tired of playing defense, tired of letting Victor set the terms, tired of watching shadows gather around people who didn't deserve to be pulled into his world. The meeting that night was held in a restaurant Marco knew well, neutral territory, public enough to discourage violence, private enough for honest conversation. Victor was already there when Marco arrived, along with 3 other men whose operations intersected with Marco's in various complicated ways. "Duca." Victor's greeting was cool. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it." Marco took the empty chair, noting positions, exits, the way Victor's people had positioned themselves. Old habits, useful ones. Though I'm curious what was so urgent it required all of us. We have concerns. This came from Petrov, who ran most of the labor operations on the docks. About your recent activities, your focus. My focus is fine. Is it? Victor leaned forward. Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you're spending more time playing teacher than running your operations. Missing meetings. Turning down deals. Getting involved in situations that don't concern you. The contractor situation concerned me. Why? Because some nobody owed money to someone else? Victor's voice had gone sharp. You used to understand that business is business. Now you're buying debts that aren't yours, protecting people who can't do anything for you, acting like you've got something to prove. Marco kept his voice level. I'm diversifying my interests, broadening my portfolio. That's smart business. Diversifying into what? Charity work? Community service? Petrov shook his head. That's not diversifying, that's distraction. The third man, Russo, had been quiet until now. He ran most of the construction unions, which meant his operations touched Marco's regularly. There's also the question of loyalty, of where your priorities lie. Here it was, the accusation Victor had been building toward, dressed up in concern but sharp as a knife underneath. My loyalty has never been in question, Marco said carefully. Hasn't it? Victor pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, then turned the screen toward Marco. It showed a photo, Marco and Ava, sitting in the terrible coffee shop, her hand on his arm. This woman, the tutor, you're spending a lot of time with her. I'm volunteering at her community center. You're getting close to someone who could be leverage, someone who could be used against you, or worse, someone who could be turned, who could be convinced to provide information about your activities. Victor's smile was cold. It makes people wonder if you're being smart or being stupid. Marco looked at the photo, at Ava's face caught in a moment of genuine concern, and felt something settle in his chest. This was the line. The moment where he either retreated back into the world he knew, where Ava became a vulnerability to be eliminated or distanced from, or he pushed forward into something different. Let me be clear, Marco said, his voice dropping into the register that made people remember exactly who they were talking to. Ava Collins is not leverage. She's not a liability. She's not any of your concern. And if anyone makes her one, we're going to have the kind of problem that doesn't get resolved with conversations. The silence that followed was heavy. Victor's expression had gone flat, dangerous. That sounds like a threat. It's a promise, same one I'll make about Marcus Wright, about the West Side Community Center, about every person in that building. They're off limits, completely, permanently. And if we decide they're not? This was Petrov testing boundaries. Then you'll find out that I haven't gotten soft. I've just gotten selective about what I'm willing to protect and what I'm willing to destroy to protect it. Marco stood. Are we done here? Sit down, Duca. Victor's voice had gone cold. We're not finished. Actually, we are. Because this meeting was never about concerns or loyalty. It was about you trying to position yourself as my replacement, using my personal life as evidence that I'm weak. Marco looked at each of them in turn. But here's what you're missing. I'm not weak, I'm evolving. And if you can't tell the difference, that's your problem, not mine. He walked out before any of them could respond. It was a power move, the kind that either worked spectacularly or got you killed. In the car, Luca was already pulling away from the curb before Marco had fully closed the door. That went well, Luca said dryly. Define well. You're still breathing. They didn't follow us. Victor looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Luca glanced in the rearview mirror. But boss, you just drew a line in the sand. They're going to test it. Let them. What about the tutor? She knows she's in the middle of this now? Marco thought about Ava, about her asking him to be careful, about her promise that she could handle truth as long as he told it. She's about to. He called her from the car. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with sleep. Marco, it's almost midnight. I know. I'm sorry, but I need to talk to you. Tonight. It's important. The warmth faded, replaced by alert concern. What happened? Not over the phone. Can I come over? She hesitated, and he could almost hear her weighing the implications of letting him into her private space this late, of crossing boundaries they'd carefully maintained. Okay, but just to talk. Just to talk, I promise. Her apartment was in a building that had seen better decades, in a neighborhood that was gentrifying slowly and unevenly. Marco had been here once before, dropping off materials she'd left at the center, but he'd never been inside. The interior was small, neat, filled with books and plants, and evidence of a life lived carefully within modest means. Ava answered the door in sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, her hair down and her face free of makeup. She looked younger like this, more vulnerable, and Marco felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it was almost painful. "Come in." She stepped aside. "You want coffee?" "I was up anyway, grading essays." "Sure." They settled at her tiny kitchen table, mugs of coffee between them, the overhead light harsh and unflattering in a way that somehow made the moment feel more honest. "Talk to me," Ava said. "What's going on?" Marco took a breath. "The situation I mentioned before, with people in my world thinking I'm getting soft. It's escalated. They're targeting the community center now, trying to use it as leverage to force me back in line." "Back in line how?" "By making me choose between the center and my business interests, between you and—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Between the life I'm trying to build and the life I've already built." Ava was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "What did you choose?" "You. The center. All of it." He met her eyes. "I told them you were off limits, that anyone who came near you or the center would have me to deal with, and I meant it. Marco, I know it wasn't my choice to make. I know I'm inserting myself into your life in ways you didn't ask for, but they already have your photo, already know who you are to me, and I can't—" His voice caught. "I can't unknow that you're in danger because of me. So I drew a line. And what happens now? Now they either respect the line or they test it. And if they test it, I handle it." "How?" She leaned forward. "How do you handle it, Marco? With violence? With threats? With the same methods that put me in this position in the first place?" It was a fair question, the question that had been eating at him since the meeting. "No, not this time. This time I handle it legally, with lawyers and investigators and press coverage and everything that makes the center too visible to touch without consequences." "You can do that?" "I can try. It's slower than the old way, less certain, but it's clean, and that matters now." He reached across the table, not quite touching her, but close. "I'm sorry for bringing this into your life, for making you a target, for all of it." "Are you sorry enough to walk away?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "Because that's an option, Marco. You could step back from the center, make it clear I don't matter to you, and this whole thing goes away. Is that what you want?" "I want my students to be safe. I want this program to survive. I want—" She stopped, looked down at her hands. "I don't want you to get hurt because you're trying to protect me." "Little late for that." Marco found himself smiling despite everything. "I'm already in this, Ava, all the way in. Walking away now doesn't make either of us safer. It just means I'm not there to help when things get complicated." "They're already complicated. They're about to get more complicated." He pulled out his phone, showed her the document Luca had prepared. "Tomorrow morning, we're announcing a full independent audit of the community center's finances. We're inviting the press, making it a transparency initiative. We're going to make the center so clean and so visible that any attack on it looks politically motivated." Ava read through the document, her expression shifting from worried to thoughtful. "This puts a spotlight on everything, on you, on me, on the connection between us." "I know. We can control the narrative, but we can't control what people assume, and some of them are going to assume we're involved. Romantically." He paused. "I need to know if you can live with that. With people thinking you're my girlfriend when you've made it clear you're not." She was quiet for a long time, reading and rereading the document. Finally, she looked up. "What if I was?" "What?" "Your girlfriend. What if I was?" She said it like she was testing the words, seeing how they fit. "Not because of this situation, not because I'm grateful for your protection, but because somewhere in the last 2 months, I started looking forward to Thursdays, started thinking about you when you weren't there, started wondering if maybe I was wrong about powerful men and the damage they do." Marco's heart was pounding so hard he was surprised she couldn't hear it. "Ava, I'm terrified, she continued, of your world, of what it means to be close to you, of losing myself in someone else's orbit again. But I'm also tired of being so careful, so guarded, so determined to protect myself that I never let anyone close enough to matter. She reached across the table and took his hand. So yeah, if people are going to assume anyway, maybe we should stop pretending they're wrong. It wasn't the declaration Marco had imagined in his more optimistic moments. It was tentative and scared and weighted with all the reasons this was probably a terrible idea. But it was real, and it was honest, and it was offered freely instead of taken or manipulated or coerced. You're sure? I'm not sure about anything except that I want to try. If you do. Marco turned his hand over, threading his fingers through hers. I do. I really do. They sat like that for a while, hands linked across cheap laminate, coffee growing cold between them. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast and uncertain, knowing the jump might end badly, but jumping anyway because the alternative was living with wondering what if. So what happens now? Ava asked eventually. Now we prepare for tomorrow. The press conference, the audit announcement, all of it, and then we deal with whatever comes next. Marco squeezed her hand. Together, if that's what you want. It's what I want. But Marco, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't sacrifice who you're trying to become for who you used to be. Promise me that if this gets ugly, you'll handle it the right way, not the easy way. It was asking him to fight with one hand tied behind his back, to face people who wouldn't hesitate to use every weapon available while he limited himself to legal channels and proper procedures. It was asking him to be better than his instincts, stronger than his history, more patient than his nature. I promise. He meant it, even knowing how hard it would be to keep. But I also promise that if anyone tries to hurt you, there's no power on earth that'll stop me from protecting you, legal or not. Marco, I know what I'm promising. I know the contradiction, but I need you to know that you come first, before my evolution, before my reputation, before everything. If it comes down to being the man you want me to be or keeping you safe, I'm choosing you safe every single time. Ava studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, but let's try really hard to make sure it doesn't come to that choice. Deal. The press conference the next morning was controlled chaos. Marco had called in every favor he had with legitimate media contacts, positioning the story as a feel-good piece about community investment and transparency. The community center's director stood at the podium, flanked by Marco and two board members, announcing the independent audit and thanking their anonymous donor for 3 years of funding. Ava stood in the back, watching with an expression Marco couldn't quite read. They'd agreed she wouldn't be photographed with him, wouldn't be mentioned by name, would maintain professional distance for the cameras. But when a reporter asked Marco about his motivation for getting involved, he found himself looking at her as he answered, I grew up in this neighborhood. I know what it's like to feel like you're invisible, like the world has already decided who you get to be and there's no changing it. These programs give people a chance to rewrite their own stories. That's worth supporting. It was a good soundbite, genuine enough to be believable, vague enough to avoid complications. The reporters ate it up. Afterward, when the cameras were gone and the center was returning to its normal rhythm, Patricia pulled Marco aside. That was well done. The board is pleased. And the timing was fortunate. We'd just gotten notice of a pending inspection that felt suspicious. This should take care of that. Good. Marco glanced toward where Ava was talking with a student. How's the program doing? Beyond the funding? Thriving, actually. We've started the waiting list intake for the new cohort, 20 students, just like we planned. Patricia followed his gaze. She's worried about you, you know. Ava? She doesn't say it, but I can tell. I'm worried about her too. That's obvious. Patricia's expression softened. For what it's worth, I think you're good for her. She's been alone for a long time, convinced she had to do everything herself. It's nice seeing her let someone help carry the weight. Marco wasn't sure he was helping carry anything. Felt more like he was adding weight with all his complications and dangers and the target he'd inadvertently painted on her back. But he appreciated the sentiment. That afternoon's tutoring session with Marcus felt different. The older man noticed immediately. You okay? You seem distracted. Just a lot going on. I saw the press conference on the center's website. Marcus set down his reading materials. That was you, wasn't it? The anonymous donor? There wasn't much point in denying it. Yeah, that was me. Why anonymous? Because it's not about me. It's about the program, the students, the work you're all doing. Marco paused. And because I didn't want credit for doing something that should be basic human decency. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, My daughter asked me about you yesterday. Said some kids at school were talking about how a crime boss was volunteering here, teaching people to read. He looked at Marco steadily. I told her you were my tutor, that you showed up every week and treated me with respect and helped me pass that exam. That's all she needs to know. The simple faith in that statement, the way Marcus had reduced everything complicated about Marco's life down to the only part that mattered in this context, made Marco's throat tight. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep showing up. That's all any of us need from you. They worked through the session, focusing on more advanced reading comprehension, now that Marcus had passed his exam. The man was eyeing management positions, which meant learning to read technical manuals and policy documents. Hard work, but Marcus attacked it with the same determination he'd shown from the beginning. After, Marco found Ava in the parking lot, standing next to her car with a frown. Tires flat again. It wasn't flat. Someone had slashed it, a clean cut, unmistakable. Marco felt rage flash hot and bright before he forced it down. This was exactly what Victor wanted, to provoke him into reacting, into proving he was still the violent man they all remembered. I'll call someone to fix it. He pulled out his phone, but Ava caught his wrist. Marco, don't do anything stupid. Changing a tire isn't stupid. You know what I mean. Her grip tightened. Whoever did this wants you to react, to prove you haven't changed. Don't give them that. She was right. Marco knew she was right, but standing there looking at deliberate damage meant to send a message, to remind him that the people he cared about were always vulnerable. It took everything he had not to call Luca and handle this the old way. Instead, he called a towing service, waited with Ava until they arrived, drove her home himself, with Luca following behind in his own car, watchful and quiet. This is going to keep happening, isn't it? Ava said as they pulled up to her building. Little things. Escalations, tests. Probably. No point lying. Until Victor decides I'm serious about the line I drew, or until he crosses it and I have to respond. And when you respond, I'll do it legally. I promised you that. You also promised you'd protect me no matter what. Those two things might not be compatible, Marco. Then I'll figure out how to make them compatible. He reached over, took her hand. I'm not going to let you get hurt. But I'm also not going to become the man I'm trying not to be anymore. There has to be a middle ground. And if there isn't, it was the question that had been haunting him since this whole thing started. The fundamental incompatibility of his two worlds, the way they pulled against each other with increasing force. He thought about Ricci's words, that eventually he'd have to choose, that he couldn't have both the empire and the woman, the power and the possibility. Then I choose you. He said it with more certainty than he felt. Every time I choose you. Ava's eyes searched his face. You say that now. But when it actually comes down to it, when you're facing real loss of everything you've built, I mean it, Ava. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't mean it. She leaned across the console and kissed him. It was brief, almost chaste, but it carried the weight of everything they weren't saying out loud. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Okay, I believe you. Just be careful, please. Always. He watched her go inside, waited until he saw her apartment light come on, then signaled Luca it was safe to leave. In the car, Luca said what they were both thinking. Victor's not going to stop with tire slashing. I know. So what's the play? Marco thought about that. The old play would have been simple. Escalate, retaliate, make it clear that touching what was his came with consequences too severe to risk. But the new play, the legal one, required patience he didn't have and faith in systems he didn't trust. We document everything, every threat, every incident, every time they push the boundary. We build a case that'll stand up in court, that'll expose them to law enforcement and regulatory scrutiny they can't afford. That takes time. I know. And in the meantime, they keep testing, keep pushing, keep putting pressure on people who can't defend themselves. Luca's voice was careful. At some point, legal channels aren't going to be fast enough. Then we make them faster. We push the investigation, lean on the contacts we have in legitimate law enforcement, make it clear that Victor's becoming more trouble than he's worth to everyone in the ecosystem. It was a plan. Not a great one. Not foolproof. But it was legal, and it was measured, and it was the kind of thing that wouldn't make Ava look at him with disappointment when she found out how he'd handled it. That night, alone in his apartment, Marco stood at the window looking out at the city he'd spent 20 years learning to control. Power, he'd learned young, came from being willing to do what others wouldn't, from being harder, colder, more ruthlessly efficient than the competition. He'd built an empire on that principle, and it had served him well. But now he was trying to build something different, something that required being vulnerable, being patient, being willing to lose battles in service of winning a different kind of war. It went against every instinct he'd honed, every lesson he'd learned the hard way. His phone buzzed. A text from Ava. "Thank you for today, for all of it. Sleep well." Marco typed back, "You too. Sweet dreams." 3 words, simple and domestic, and so far removed from the person he'd been just months ago that it felt like looking at a stranger's life. But it was his life now, or at least the life he was trying to build. And if Victor or anyone else thought they could take it from him without consequences, they were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. Even if those consequences had to come through legal channels and proper procedures and all the slow grinding machinery of legitimate justice. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Luca called before Marco was even fully awake, his voice tight with something that sounded like satisfaction. "Turn on the news, Channel 7. Marco grabbed the remote, found the channel. A reporter stood in front of a building Marco recognized, one of Victor's operations, technically a legitimate import business, but everyone knew what really got moved through those warehouses. Federal raid early this morning, with agents from multiple agencies executing search warrants. Sources tell us this is part of a larger investigation into labor trafficking and customs violations. Several individuals have been taken into custody, though names have not yet been released." Marco watched as agents carried boxes from the building, as Victor himself was led out in handcuffs, his expression carefully blank. "How?" Marco asked. "Anonymous tip, apparently. Someone sent the feds a very detailed package of information, shipping manifests, payroll records, communications, everything they needed to build a case." Luca paused. "Weird coincidence, that." It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been building this case for weeks, maybe months, waiting for the right moment to spring it, and Marco had a good idea who. "Ricci." "That'd be my guess? You want me to confirm?" "No. If it was him, he did it for his own reasons. Best not to connect ourselves to it." Marco watched as more agents emerged from the building. "This changes things." "Damn right it does. With Victor out of play, you've got breathing room. Time to consolidate, to make moves without him blocking every step." But Marco was thinking about something else, about a promise he'd made to handle things legally, to not become the man he used to be even when provoked, about how sometimes the universe provided solutions that let you keep your hands clean while still winning the war. "Get me a meeting with Victor's second, today if possible." "You sure that's going to look opportunistic?" "It is opportunistic, but it's also smart. Victor's going to be tied up in legal problems for months, maybe years. Someone needs to step in and keep his operations running. Better it's someone who understands the new rules." "Which are?" "No targeting civilians, no involving people who aren't in the life, no using community institutions as leverage." Marco turned off the TV. "Business stays business, personal stays personal, and anyone who can't understand that distinction doesn't get to stay in business." It was a new model, or at least new for their world. The idea that you could run operations without making everyone around you collateral damage, that you could have power without using it to hurt innocent people. Marco wasn't naive enough to think it was purely altruistic. Keeping civilians out of it was also good risk management, reduced exposure to law enforcement, made everyone's operations cleaner and safer. But it was also the right thing to do. And somewhere in the last 2 months, that had started to matter to him in a way it never had before. The meeting with Victor's second happened in a different restaurant with different stakes. The man, Dmitri, was wary but pragmatic, smart enough to see which way the wind was blowing. "Victor's going to be fighting this for a while," Dmitri said. "Even if he beats it, the scrutiny is going to make operations difficult." So you need someone to help manage the transition, keep things stable. Marco kept his voice neutral. I'm offering partnership, not a takeover. Your operations stay yours, but we coordinate better, avoid stepping on each other's toes, make sure we're not creating exposure for each other. And in return? In return, you agree to the boundaries I mentioned. Community centers, schools, churches, off limits. No using people's families as leverage unless they're actively in the business. No collateral damage that brings heat none of us need. Marco paused. It's good business, Dmitri. Clean business lasts longer. Dmitri considered this. Victor's not going to like it when he gets out. Victor brought federal attention down on himself by not being careful, by letting personal grudges override smart business. That's not a model that works anymore. Marco leaned forward. The world's changing. We change with it, or we get left behind. Your choice. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. The feds are watching everyone now. The people who adapt fastest are the ones who survive. He left the meeting uncertain if he'd accomplished anything, but the seed was planted. And seeds, given time and the right conditions, had a way of growing into something useful. That Thursday, Marco showed up at the community center knowing it might be the last peaceful session he'd have in a while. The aftermath of Victor's arrest was still playing out, alliances shifting, people choosing sides. But for 1 hour, he was just a tutor helping Marcus prepare for his first day at his new city job. I start Monday, Marcus said, pride evident in every word. Facilities manager, better pay, better hours, actual benefits. My wife cried when I told her. You earned it, Marcus, all of it. Couldn't have done it without you. Marcus gathered his materials. I mean that. You gave me a chance when you didn't have to, treated me like I mattered when nobody else did. That's the kind of thing a man doesn't forget. After the session, Ava was waiting in the hallway. She pulled him into her office and closed the door. I saw the news about Victor. Yeah. Did you? No, I didn't orchestrate it, but I'm not going to pretend I'm upset about the timing. Marco sat on the edge of her desk. Does it bother you that I'm relieved he's in custody? Should it? I don't know. You wanted me to handle things legally. Technically, someone did, just not me. He looked at her. I'm trying to figure out if there's a difference, morally. Ava was quiet for a moment. I think there is. You didn't create the situation that got him arrested. You didn't manufacture evidence or frame him. You just didn't stop it from happening. Does that make it better or worse? I don't know. She moved closer, standing between his knees. But I know you kept your promise. You didn't resort to violence. You didn't become the person you're trying not to be. And that counts for something. Even if the outcome's the same, the outcome isn't the same. Victor's in federal custody, facing legitimate charges through the legal system. That's completely different than if you'd... She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Marco pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. I'm trying, Ava, to be better. To find a way to exist in my world without destroying everything good in yours. I don't know if it's working. It's working. She touched his face. Maybe not perfectly. Maybe not smoothly. But you're here. You're trying. That's more than most people in your position would do. They stayed like that for a moment, the world narrowing to just the two of them in a small office in a community center that smelled like old coffee and hope. It wasn't the life Marco had imagined for himself at 19, when he'd been busy building power and burning bridges and learning to be feared. But it was the life he wanted now, and he was starting to believe he might actually get to keep it. The weeks that followed Victor's arrest were strange, like walking through a house where all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. Marco waited for retaliation that never came, for Victor's associates to rally and push back against the new order he was trying to establish. Instead, what he got was cautious acceptance. Dmitri called 3 days after their meeting. I talked to the others. We're willing to try your way. For now. For now is good enough. Marco had learned to take victories where he could find them, even small ones hedged with qualifications. The arrangement they worked out wasn't perfect. There were still gray areas, still operations that existed outside the law, still money that moved through channels that wouldn't survive scrutiny. Marco couldn't transform an entire ecosystem overnight, and he was smart enough not to try. But the rules about civilians, about keeping violence contained to people who'd chosen this life, about leaving community institutions alone. Those stuck. Partly because they made practical sense, partly because word had gotten out about what happened to Victor when he'd pushed too hard. Nobody wanted to be the next example. Marco started spending less time managing crises and more time actually running his legitimate businesses. The construction company he'd built as a front turned out to be genuinely profitable when he actually paid attention to it. The real estate holdings generated real income. He had lawyers and accountants who could structure things properly, who could help him build something that would survive legal scrutiny. It was boring compared to the life he'd lived before. It was also sustainable in a way that his old operations never had been, always one mistake away from federal indictment or violent overthrow. "You're getting domestic," Luca observed one afternoon when Marco turned down a deal that would have been lucrative but messy. "Next thing you know, you'll be coaching Little League." "I don't know anything about baseball." "That's not the point." But Luca was smiling. "It's good to see, boss. You seem lighter, less like you're waiting for the next disaster." Marco hadn't thought about it that way, but Luca was right. The constant tension that had lived in his shoulders for years had eased. He slept better. Woke up without immediately calculating threats and countermoves. It was unsettling how quickly he'd adapted to not living in crisis mode. Thursday afternoons remained his favorite part of the week. Marcus had moved on to a new tutoring program for advanced literacy, working toward eventually taking college classes. They still met sometimes, not as tutor and student anymore, but as something approaching friends, to talk about books Marcus was reading or problems he was navigating at his new job. "My daughter's reading level is higher than mine now," Marcus said over coffee one Thursday. "But you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm proud of her, and I can still help her just in different ways." "That's growth," Marco said, recognizing that help doesn't always look like having all the answers. "Yeah," Marcus gave him a knowing look. "You learned that from tutoring or from dating that pretty woman who runs the center?" Marco felt heat creep up his neck. "Is it that obvious?" "Brother, everyone knows. The way you look at her, the way she looks at you when she thinks nobody's watching, might as well take out a billboard." Marcus grinned. "It's good, though. She's good for you. Makes you human instead of scary." "I was never that scary. Man, the first time I met you, I was terrified. You got this way of looking at people like you can see right through them, like you're 3 steps ahead of whatever they're thinking." Marcus paused. "You still got it, but now there's something else, too. Something softer. That's her influence." Marco thought about that as he walked through the community center later, watching Ava work with a new student. She was patient but demanding, pushing the woman to try harder while celebrating every small success. She'd cut her hair shorter recently, and it made her look even more fierce, even more determined. She caught him watching and smiled, and Marco felt something settle in his chest that he was learning to recognize as contentment. Not the sharp satisfaction of a deal closed or a rival eliminated, but something quieter and more lasting. "You're staring," she said when the student left for a break. "Can't help it. You're good at this." "At teaching or at catching you staring?" "Both." He moved closer. "You have plans tonight?" "Depends. What did you have in mind?" "Dinner. Actual dinner at an actual restaurant, not terrible coffee and day-old pastries." Ava pretended to consider. "Is this you asking me on a real date, Marco Duca?" "It is. If you're interested." "I might be." "Where are we going?" "Someplace nice, where I can show you off and maybe hold your hand without worrying about maintaining professional distance." She laughed, and the sound filled the small office like light. "Okay, but I'm picking the restaurant. Your idea of nice probably involves wine that costs more than my rent." "Well, what's wrong with expensive wine?" "Nothing, if you're trying to impress someone. But I'm already impressed. Now you just have to feed me." She kissed his cheek. "Pick me up at 7. The restaurant she chose was a small Italian place in her neighborhood, family-owned and loud and completely unpretentious. The wine came in carafes instead of bottles. The pasta was served in portions meant to feed families, and nobody recognized Marco or cared who he was beyond being Ava's date. "This is perfect," Marco said, meaning it. "Yeah?" Ava looked pleased. "I wasn't sure if you'd hate it. It's not exactly your usual scene." "My usual scene involves a lot of posturing and bad decisions. This is better." He reached across the table for her hand. Thank you for giving me a chance. I know it wasn't easy. It's still not easy, she admitted. There are days when I wonder if I'm crazy for dating someone with your history, your complications. Days when I think about how much simpler my life would be if I just kept saying no. And on those days? On those days, I remember that simple isn't the same as better, and that you show up. Every time, even when it's hard, you show up. She squeezed his hand. That matters more than I knew it could. They talked through dinner about everything and nothing. Ava told him about her students' progress, about the new funding they'd secured, about her dreams of expanding the program to other neighborhoods. Marco found himself talking about things he rarely discussed. His mother, who died when he was 12, and left him with his father's anger and no buffer against it. The teacher who'd believed in him before he'd learned to stop believing in himself. The moment he'd realized he was good at reading people and making them do what he wanted, and how that talent had shaped everything that came after. Do you regret it? Ava asked. The path you took? Marco thought about that. I regret some of the choices I made along the way, some of the people I hurt, but the path itself. He paused. It taught me things I needed to know. About power, about survival, about what happens when you let yourself become something you're not sure you can come back from. Without that path, I wouldn't have ended up here, with you. So no, I don't regret it. I just want to do better going forward. That's all any of us can do. She smiled. Learn from where we've been and try to be better than we were. They walked back to her apartment slowly, hands linked, stopping to look at shop windows and listen to street musicians and exist in the kind of ordinary moment Marco had spent 20 years being too important for. When they reached her building, Ava turned to face him. You want to come up? It was an invitation weighted with everything they hadn't quite said yet, all the ways their relationship was shifting from tentative to intentional. Marco kissed her softly, carefully, like she was something precious that might break. I want to, but I also want to do this right. Take our time. Not rush just because we can. Ava looked surprised, then pleased. Who are you and what have you done with the man who couldn't take no for an answer? That man learned that some things are worth waiting for. Marco kissed her again, less carefully this time. I'll see you Thursday? Thursday, and maybe Saturday? If you're free. I'm free. He'd make himself free, would move whatever needed moving to have that time with her. The next morning brought unexpected news. Victor had taken a plea deal, 20 years, eligible for parole in 12. The investigation had turned up enough evidence that fighting it would have been suicide, so he'd taken the offer and would be transferred to a federal facility by the end of the month. That's it then, Luca said when they got the news. He's done. Out of the picture for at least a decade, maybe permanently depending on how things shake out inside. Marco should have felt triumphant. This was the ultimate victory. His enemy removed without him having to directly destroy him, handled through legitimate channels that kept Marco's hands clean. But instead, he felt something more complex. Relief, certainly, but also a strange kind of sadness for the waste of it all, for lives spent building power that dissolved the moment the legal system actually paid attention. Make sure his family's taken care of, Marco said. His wife, his kids. They didn't choose this. Luca raised an eyebrow. You're taking care of Victor's family? I'm making sure they have what they need. There's a difference. Marco thought about third-grade daughters and wives who'd never asked to marry men in this life. Set up a trust. Anonymous. Enough for education, living expenses. They shouldn't suffer because of choices he made. You're a better man than he deserves. I'm trying to be a better man than I used to be. This is part of that. The weeks blurred into months. Summer gave way to fall, and Marco found himself settling into rhythms he'd never imagined for himself. Thursday afternoons at the community center became sacrosanct. Saturday dates with Ava became the highlights of his week. His legitimate businesses grew while his illegal ones shrank, not because he was crusading for reform, but because he was gradually choosing different investments, different partnerships, different ways of operating. It wasn't a clean break. He still had associates who operated in gray areas, still had relationships that wouldn't survive daylight scrutiny, still made decisions that prioritized profit over principle when the stakes were purely business. But the pattern was clear. He was moving away from who he'd been, even if he couldn't fully become who he wanted to be overnight. "You know what's weird?" Ava said one Saturday afternoon as they walked through the park near her apartment. "I can't remember what my life was like before you. Like, logically, I know it was only 6 months ago, but it feels like you've always been there. Is that good weird or bad weird?" "Good weird, scary weird." She stopped walking, turned to face him. "Marco, I'm falling in love with you. I probably have been for weeks now, and I keep trying to talk myself out of it because of all the logical reasons this is complicated and potentially disastrous. But I can't, and I don't want to anymore." Marco's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it. "Ava, you don't have to say it back. I just needed you to know that this isn't casual for me anymore, that I'm all in, even knowing what I know, even with all the complications." She looked nervous and brave and absolutely stunning. "So, yeah, that's where I am. I love you too." The words came easily, surprising him with their simplicity. "I think I started loving you the moment you told me no in that club and meant it. Every day since then has just been me falling further." She kissed him then, right there in the park with joggers passing by and kids playing on the grass, and the whole ordinary world continuing around them. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears. "So what do we do now?" "Now we keep going, keep building this, keep figuring out how to make our lives fit together." Marco pulled her close. "I know I'm not easy. I know my life comes with complications yours doesn't, but I'm willing to work for this if you are." "I am. I really am." They stood there for a while, holding each other while the afternoon faded into evening. Marco thought about the man he'd been at 19, building power on fear and violence, about the man he'd been at 30, so deep in the life he couldn't imagine anything else, about the man he was now, standing in a park with a woman who made him want to be better, who believed he could be better, who loved him anyway when he fell short. It wasn't the ending he'd expected, but it was the one he wanted. 3 months later, Marcus invited them to his daughter's school for a reading event. The little girl, Jasmine, 9 years old with her father's smile, was receiving an award for reading improvement. Marcus stood in the back of the gymnasium, watching with unconcealed pride as his daughter accepted her certificate. "She reads to me now," Marcus told them quietly. "Every night before bed. We take turns. She picks books that are too hard for me sometimes, and I struggle through them, and she helps me with the words I don't know." His voice was thick. "It's the best part of my day." After the ceremony, Jasmine ran over and threw her arms around her father. Then, shyly, she looked at Marco. "My dad says you helped him learn to read." "Your dad did all the work. I just showed up." "Still, thank you." She said it with such serious sincerity that Marco felt his throat tighten. "You're welcome, Jasmine. I'm proud of both of you." In the car afterward, Ava was quiet. Marco glanced over to find her wiping her eyes. "You okay?" "Yeah, that's why I do this." Moments like that, families changed because someone took the time. She reached for his hand. "You changed them, Marco. You changed Marcus's whole family's trajectory by showing up every Thursday and treating him like he mattered." "So did you. You built the program, you hired the tutors, you created the space for that change to happen." "We did it together." She squeezed his hand. "I like that. Us doing things together." "Yeah, me too." They drove in comfortable silence for a while before Ava said, "I got a job offer from a literacy nonprofit downtown. Big operation, national scope. They want me to direct their regional programs." Marco's stomach dropped. "That's amazing. Congratulations." "I haven't accepted yet." "Why not?" "Because it would mean leaving the community center, leaving the students I've been working with, leaving—" She paused. "It would mean less direct teaching and more administration. More money, more prestige, more impact theoretically, but less of what I love about this work." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. What do you think I should do?" Marco thought carefully before answering. "I think you should do whatever makes you feel the way you look when you're teaching. The way you looked when Marcus told you his daughter reads to him now. Whatever job gives you more of that feeling, that's the one you should take." Ava was quiet for a long moment. "The community center gives me that feeling. Every day. Even on the hard days." Then that's your answer. But the other job could help more people, could scale the programs I believe in, could make you miserable if it takes you away from the work you actually love doing. Marco pulled over into a parking lot so he could look at her properly. Ava, you don't have to save everyone. You don't have to scale everything. Sometimes small and direct is more valuable than large and distant. Is that Marco Duca, former crime boss, telling me that bigger isn't always better? Former crime boss is generous, current crime boss trying to reform, maybe. He smiled. But yeah, I spent 20 years thinking I needed to control more, own more, be more powerful. And you know what? I was miserable. Now I tutor one guy and help fund one program and date one woman who makes me crazy in the best way. My life is smaller. It's also better. She kissed him, soft and grateful. Okay, I'll stay at the center. Turn down the big job. Keep doing what I love, even if it's not prestigious. There's nothing more prestigious than changing lives. Trust me. 6 months after that conversation, Marco proposed. Not with a spectacle or a grand gesture, but on a Thursday afternoon after his tutoring session with a new student, in the same terrible office where Ava had first agreed to give him a chance. He'd carried the ring in his pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment, before realizing that the right moment was just whenever they were together. "Marry me," he said, pulling out a simple platinum band with a single stone. "I know it's fast. I know we've still got things to figure out, but I know I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." Ava stared at the ring, then at him, her expression cycling through surprise and joy and tears. "You're serious?" "Completely. But if you need time, yes." She was laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes." He slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her while Patricia cheered from the hallway, because apparently privacy didn't exist in community centers. By the time they emerged from the office, half the staff knew, and by the next day all the students did too. Marcus gave Marco a bear hug that probably cracked a rib. "About damn time. We were all wondering when you'd get around to it." "You knew I was going to propose?" "Man, the way you look at her, everyone knew. We were just waiting for you to figure it out." They got married 4 months later in a small ceremony at the community center because Ava insisted and Marco would have married her anywhere she wanted. The guest list was a strange mix: Marcus and his family, Ava's students and fellow tutors, Patricia and the board members. Luca stood as best man, looking uncomfortable in his suit, but genuinely happy. Ricci came, a surprise guest who gave them his blessing and a check large enough to fund the literacy program for another 5 years. "For your future," Ricci told them at the reception, "both of you. You did something I never thought possible. You got out while keeping your soul intact. That deserves celebrating." Victor's name wasn't mentioned once. His shadow didn't touch the day at all. It was like he'd never existed, like the threat he'd posed had dissolved into nothing the moment Marco had chosen differently. In his toast, Marcus said something that stayed with Marco long after the evening ended. "I used to think powerful people didn't care about regular folks like me, that we were invisible to anyone who mattered. Then this man," he gestured at Marco, "showed up every Thursday and proved me wrong. Not with money, though that helped. Not with connections, though those mattered too. But by treating me like I was worth his time. Like learning to read at 43 was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. That changed my life, changed my family's life. And I figure if he could change for the better, if he could become the kind of man who shows up and gives a damn, then any of us can." So here's to Marco and Ava, to people who prove that who you were doesn't have to be who you are. The applause was thunderous. Ava was crying. Marco was pretty sure he was too, though he'd deny it later. They spent their wedding night in Ava's apartment, soon to be their apartment, surrounded by boxes because they were combining households, and neither of them was particularly organized. Marco had sold his downtown place with its expensive view, choosing instead to move into her neighborhood, her world, her life. "No regrets?" Ava asked as they lay in bed, exhausted and happy and surrounded by evidence of lives being merged. "About marrying you? Never. About everything else, the life you gave up, the power, I didn't give up anything that mattered." Marco pulled her closer. "I traded one kind of power for another. The power to make people afraid for the power to make people's lives better. The power to take what I wanted for the power to build something that lasts. It's not a loss. It's an upgrade. When did you get so wise? When I met a woman who refused to be impressed by the wrong things. He kissed her forehead. You made me want to be impressive in ways that actually matter. You were always impressive, Marco. You just didn't know which parts of yourself were worth showing off. They fell asleep like that, tangled together in a too-small bed in an apartment that would never appear in design magazines, in a neighborhood that still had rough edges and real problems. It wasn't the life Marco had imagined for himself. It wasn't the empire he'd built or the power he'd accumulated. It was better. A year later, they stood in the community center's newly expanded space, funded by a combination of Marco's donations and grants Ava had written. The literacy program now served 50 students with a staff of 12 tutors. Marcus had been promoted to a management position with the city and was taking night classes toward a degree in public administration. His daughter Jasmine volunteered at the center's kids' reading program, helping younger children discover books. We did this, Ava said, looking around at students bent over workbooks, at tutors patiently explaining concepts, at all the quiet transformation happening in this unremarkable building. You did this, Marco corrected. I just helped fund it. You did more than that. You changed the culture, made it okay for people with resources to actually show up and do the work, not just write checks from a distance. She leaned against him. You know what the students call you? Mr. Marco. Like you're everyone's favorite teacher, not a former crime boss trying to go legitimate. Former feels generous. Current legitimate businessman with a complicated past. Ava grinned. Better? Accurate. Marco's operations were almost entirely legal now, his businesses restructured with help from lawyers who specialized in exactly this kind of transformation. There were still connections to his old life, still people who remembered who he'd been, still moments when the past threatened to resurface. But those moments were fewer and farther between, and Marco had learned to handle them without reverting to old patterns. His phone buzzed. A text from Luca. Dimitri wants a meeting, says it's important. Marco sighed. This was the reality of his life now. 1 foot in the world he'd built with Ava, 1 foot in the world he was trying to leave behind. The balance was delicate, sometimes precarious, never quite stable. Work? Ava asked, reading his expression. Yeah, nothing urgent. He pocketed his phone. I'll handle it later. You sure? I don't want you putting things off for me. I'm sure. And he was. Whatever Dimitri wanted could wait. This moment, standing in a community center watching lives change, holding his wife's hand, being part of something that mattered in ways that had nothing to do with power or profit, this couldn't. That evening, Marco met with Dimitri in the same restaurant where they'd negotiated their first agreement. The man looked tired, older than he had a year ago. Victor's trying to run things from inside, Dimitri said without preamble. Making calls, giving orders, undermining the agreements we made. It's getting messy. So tell him no. It's not that simple. He still has loyalists, people who think the old ways were better. Marco thought about this. The old ways had been simpler in some respects. Clearer hierarchies, easier rules, power maintained through force rather than negotiation. But they'd also been unsustainable, always one mistake away from collapse. What do you need from me? I need you to talk to him. He respects you, or at least respects what you built. Maybe he'll listen. And if he doesn't, then we have a problem, because I can't keep managing his operations and fighting his interference. One or the other has to give. Marco agreed to think about it, knowing there wasn't much to think about. Victor's inability to let go was predictable, almost inevitable. Men like them, like Marco used to be, didn't adapt well to powerlessness. The question was how to handle it without compromising the life Marco had built. He talked it through with Ava that night, something that would have been unthinkable in his old life. Sharing strategic problems with a civilian, with someone outside the business, would have been seen as weakness. What do you think you should do? Ava asked. Honestly, I think I should let it go. Let Dimitri handle Victor however he wants. It's not my problem anymore. But if I don't intervene, there's a chance things get violent, people get hurt, and some of those people might be innocent bystanders. Marco ran a hand through his hair. I got out. I built this new life. but I can't just pretend the old world doesn't exist or that my choices don't affect what happens there. So you're going to talk to Victor. I think I have to. One last conversation to make it clear that the world's moved on, that the old ways aren't coming back, that he needs to let go. Marco looked at her. Is that okay? Or is that me backsliding into being the person I'm trying not to be? Ava considered carefully. I think there's a difference between handling your past and being consumed by it. If you go talk to Victor to prevent violence, to help people transition to a better system, that's handling your past. If you go because you miss the power or the control or the feeling of being feared, that's backsliding. And if I'm not sure which it is, then trust yourself. You've proven you can make better choices. This is just another one. Marco arranged the meeting through official channels, a prison visit, documented and supervised, nothing that could be misinterpreted as coordinating illegal activity. Victor looked diminished in his prison uniform, older and harder and angrier than Marco remembered. So you came, Victor said when they sat down across from each other with a table and a guard between them. Thought you were too good for us now. I'm not too good for anyone. I just made different choices. Different choices? Victor's laugh was bitter. You mean you sold out, went soft, chose a woman over everything we built? I chose a life that wouldn't end in a cell or coffin. You should try it sometime. I'm in a cell right now because you didn't back me up, because you changed the rules without asking the rest of us. The rules needed to change. They were getting us all killed or locked up. What happened to you proved that. They argued in circles for a while, Victor insisting the old ways were better, Marco pointing out that the old ways had ended with Victor in federal prison. Finally, Marco leaned forward. You need to let it go. Let Dimitri run things his way. Let the business evolve. You're going to be in here for at least another decade. By the time you get out, the world you knew will be gone anyway. You can either accept that and maybe build something different when you're released, or you can fight it and make everything harder for everyone. Including you? Including me. Including your family. Including all the people who depend on the stability we've created. Marco held his gaze. I'm not asking you to like me or forgive me or even understand what I'm doing. I'm asking you to step back and let the rest of us move forward. Victor was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. You really believe this new way is better? I do. And you're happy? With your teacher wife and your community center and your legitimate businesses? Happier than I've ever been. Then you're a better man than I am. Victor said it without bitterness, just statement of fact. All right, I'll back off. Let Dimitri run things. Not for you, for my kids. I don't want them visiting me in here for the rest of their lives because I couldn't let go of power I don't have anymore. It was more than Marco had expected and less than he'd hoped for. But it was enough. He left the prison feeling like he'd closed a door that had been standing open too long, letting in cold air and old ghosts. 2 years after their wedding, Ava was pregnant. The news came as a surprise even though they'd been trying, and Marco found himself terrified in ways that facing down armed men had never made him feel. This was different. This was a life he'd be responsible for shaping, a person who'd inherit his choices and his past, whether he wanted them to or not. What if I'm a terrible father? He asked Ava one night, his hand on her barely showing stomach. What if you're a great one? I don't know how to be. My father was... He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Your father isn't you. You've already proven you can break patterns, can choose differently, can build something better than what you came from. She covered his hand with hers. This baby is going to be so lucky. They'll have a father who shows up, who does the work, who tries every day to be better. How do you know? Because I know you, and because you're scared. Good parents are scared. They know what they're risking, what they could mess up. It's the people who aren't scared who usually cause the damage. Their daughter was born on a Thursday, because of course she was, in the early morning hours when the city was just starting to wake up. Marco held her for the first time and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This small person, red-faced and screaming and completely dependent on him, was more important than any empire he'd built or power he'd accumulated. Her name? The nurse asked. They'd discussed dozens of options, but standing there with his daughter in his arms, Marco knew there was only one choice. Grace. Her name is Grace, because that's what he'd been given. Grace from Ava, grace from Marcus, grace from a community that had accepted him despite knowing what he was. Grace to change, grace to build something better, grace to become a man worthy of holding this small person who trusted him completely. The first few months were chaos. Marco discovered that running a business empire was easier than managing a newborn's sleep schedule. But he showed up. For the midnight feedings, the diaper changes, the exhausted mornings when Ava needed sleep, and he took Grace to the park just to give them both a break. "You're good at this," Ava said one afternoon, watching him soothe Grace back to sleep. "At what? I have no idea what I'm doing." "At being present, at trying, at loving her even when it's hard." She kissed his cheek. "That's all parenting is, really. Showing up and doing your best and hoping it's enough." Marcus visited when Grace was 3 months old, bringing a gift, a children's book of poetry. "For when she's older, so her dad can read it to her." He grinned. "And because you helped me learn to read, so now I'm passing it on. That's how this works, right? We help each other and then we help the next generation." "That's exactly how it works," Marco agreed. Grace grew. Started smiling, then laughing, then crawling. Marco found himself doing things he never imagined, playing on the floor with blocks, reading board books until he had them memorized, singing lullabies in a voice that was probably terrible, but Grace didn't seem to mind. His businesses continued to run, now managed more by competent people he'd hired than by his direct oversight. He still made the big decisions, still showed up for important meetings, but he'd learned to delegate in ways his younger self would have considered weakness. "You're not worried about losing control?" Luca asked during one of their increasingly rare strategy sessions. "Of the business? Sometimes, but I'm more worried about losing moments with Grace. She's only going to be this small once." Marco shrugged. "The business will still be there when she's older. Her childhood won't. You've changed so much I barely recognize you sometimes." "Is that bad?" "It's different, better, I think. You seem like—" Luca paused, searching for words. "You seem like you're living instead of just surviving. That's worth more than all the empire building we did." On Grace's first birthday, they threw a party at the community center. It was crowded with people from both their lives. Marco's associates who'd made the transition to legitimate business, Ava's students and fellow teachers, Marcus and his family, neighbors from their building. The mix should have been awkward, these different worlds colliding. Instead, it felt like proof that integration was possible, that you could hold multiple identities without them destroying each other. Grace sat in her high chair, cake smeared on her face, laughing at something only she found funny. Marco looked around the room, at his wife organizing games with the precision she brought to everything, at the community that had accepted him despite everything, at the life they'd built together, and felt something he'd spent 20 years not believing in. He felt home. "Thank you," he said to Ava later when the party had wound down and Grace was asleep against his shoulder. "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth saving, for pushing me to be better, for building this life with me even when it would have been easier to walk away." "You're worth it, Marco. You always were. You just needed someone to show you which parts of yourself were worth keeping and which parts you could let go." She leaned against him. "Besides, you've made me better too. Made me braver, more willing to take risks, more open to possibilities I'd written off. We're good together. Yeah, we really are." 5 years later, Marco stood in the community center, now the Marcus Wright Literacy Center, renamed after the man whose determination had inspired 3 rounds of expansion, watching Ava accept an award for her work. Grace sat next to him, 7 years old and already reading at a 5th grade level, proud of her mother in the way kids are when they don't yet understand how remarkable their parents' accomplishments are. "That's Mama," Grace whispered. "She's getting a prize." "She is, because she helps people learn to read, like we've talked about." "Like you helped Mr. Marcus?" "Like I tried to help Mr. Marcus, he did most of the work himself." "But you showed up," Grace said, repeating something she'd heard Marco say 100 times. "Showing up matters." "It does, sweetheart. It really does." In her acceptance speech, Ava talked about the power of literacy to transform lives, about the importance of seeing people's potential rather than their limitations, about building communities where everyone's contribution mattered. She didn't mention Marco by name, but when she talked about partners who support your vision and help you build something bigger than yourself, she looked right at him. After the ceremony, they walked home as a family, Grace between them holding both their hands. The neighborhood was quiet in the evening light, familiar and safe in ways that had nothing to do with Marco's old methods of ensuring safety. "Dad?" Grace asked as they walked. "When I grow up, can I help people too? Like you and Mama?" "You can do anything you want, sweetheart, as long as you try your best and treat people with respect." "Did you always treat people with respect?" It was a child's question, innocent and direct. Marco glanced at Ava, who gave him a small nod. "Your story to tell, your truth to share." "No," Marco said honestly. "When I was younger, I made mistakes. I hurt people sometimes. I did things I'm not proud of." "But you got better?" "I'm trying to get better. Every day. That's all any of us can do. Try to be a little better than we were yesterday." "I think you're doing good," Grace said with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old's judgment. "You help lots of people, and you make Mama happy, and you read me stories every night. Those are the important things, aren't they?" "The most important," Grace agreed. That night, after Grace was asleep, Marco and Ava sat on their balcony, a modest space, nothing like the expensive view he'd once had, but theirs together. The city stretched out below them, all those lives being lived in all their complicated beauty. "Do you ever miss it?" Ava asked. "The power, the control, the way people used to fear you?" Marco thought about it honestly. "Sometimes, when things are hard or complicated or moving too slowly, there are moments when I remember how easy it used to be to just make things happen, to cut through problems with force instead of patience." He took her hand. "But then I think about what I'd have to give up to have that back. You. Great. This life. And it's not even close. This is better. This is real. Even with all the complications? Even knowing you can't ever fully escape your past? Even with all of that. Because the past is just where I came from. It's not where I'm going." He pulled her closer. "Where I'm going is forward, with you, with our daughter, building something that lasts beyond me, that means something beyond power." They sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened into night. Somewhere in the city, Marco's former associates were probably making deals and calculating angles and living the life he'd left behind. Somewhere, Victor was still in prison, maybe learning, or maybe just waiting for release. Somewhere, the world was still full of people choosing power over principle, control over connection. But here, in this small apartment, in this neighborhood where he'd started and returned to, Marco had found something better. Not perfect. Their life was still complicated, still touched by his past in ways that required constant navigation. But real. Built on honesty and effort and the daily choice to show up and do better. Grace called out from her room, some nightmare or worry pulling her from sleep. Marco stood to go to her, but Ava was already up, already moving toward their daughter's room with the practiced ease of 5 years of parenting. "I've got her," Ava said. "You stay here. Relax for a minute." Marco listened to Ava's voice soothing Grace, to their daughter's fears easing, to the ordinary magic of comfort freely given. This was his empire now, not built on fear or money or control, but on love and presence and the simple act of showing up day after day. It was smaller than what he'd once commanded. It was infinitely more valuable. And standing there on that balcony, listening to his family, Marco understood that this was what winning actually looked like. Not power over others, but connection with them. Not taking what you wanted, but building what mattered. Not being feared, but being loved. The man in the green dress had noticed all those years ago would hardly recognize him now. That Marco had been all sharp edges and hunger, measuring worth and control, and seeing people as either assets or obstacles. This Marco, husband, father, reformed criminal trying daily to do better, was softer in some ways but stronger in others. He'd learned that real power wasn't about making people afraid. It was about making them believe they could be more than they thought possible. About showing up. About trying. About choosing growth over comfort, honesty over image, love over fear. About being worth the grace you'd been given and paying it forward to everyone who came after. In the end, that was the only empire worth building. The only victory that mattered, the only power that lasted. And Marco had finally learned to reach for it.